There is a country so vast that you could fit the entire continent of Europe inside it and still have room left over. A country with more freshwater lakes than the rest of the world combined. A country where entire mountain ranges exist that have never been mapped in detail, where boreal forests stretch for millions of unbroken acres, where rivers run through territories so remote that a person could walk for 2 weeks in any direction and never cross a single road, never see a single structure built by human hands, never hear a single sound that was not wind or water or the distant call of something wild moving through the trees. That country is Canada. And every single year, approximately 100,000 people are reported missing within its borders. Let that number settle for a moment. 100,000 people. Vanished. Some of them are found quickly. Some of them are runaways. People who left on their own terms and simply did not tell anyone where they were going. Some are found weeks or months later, alive, having simply slipped between the cracks of record-keeping and circumstance. But a significant number of them are never found at all. They step into the wilderness, or walk out of a city, or drive down a highway, and simply cease to exist in any traceable form. The land swallows them and offers nothing back. No body, no evidence, no answer. Per capita, Canada has one of the highest rates of missing persons of any developed nation on the planet. When you adjust for population size, the numbers become genuinely unsettling. A country of roughly 38 million people, losing 100,000 reported missing individuals per year, represents a disappearance rate that puts it in the company of nations experiencing active conflict or humanitarian crisis. Not stable, wealthy, first world democracies with functioning law enforcement and modern infrastructure. And yet this fact receives almost no sustained attention. It does not dominate news cycles. It does not drive national conversations. It exists as a kind of background hum, a low-frequency mystery that most Canadians are vaguely aware of. The way you are vaguely aware of the sound of traffic when you live near a highway. You stop hearing it. You stop asking why. Tonight, we are going to ask why. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know, where are you right now and what time is it? Because the answer is not simple and it is not comfortable, and it stretches back much further than most people realize. The story of Canada's missing is not just a story about policing failures or inadequate funding or the logistical impossibility of monitoring a country that is the second largest on the surface of the earth. It is a story about the land itself, about what that land is, what it has always been, what happened on it before anyone wrote anything down. It is a story about the people who have lived in that landscape for thousands of years, and the people who arrived and transformed it, and the things that were lost in that transformation, that we are only now beginning to understand the true cost of. It is a story about geography and history and politics, and something older and stranger than any of those words can fully contain. To understand why people disappear in Canada at the rate they do, you have to understand what Canada actually is. Not the country you see on maps, with its neat borders and provincial lines and cities connected by thin threads of highway. The real Canada. The Canada that exists beneath and behind and beyond all of that. 90% of Canada's population lives within 150 kilometers of the United States border. This is a fact that sounds almost unbelievable until you look at a map and understand why. The rest of the country, the overwhelming majority of its landmass, is something that does not have a polite or accurate word in modern English. The closest you might come is wilderness, but that word carries connotations of emptiness that are both inaccurate and dangerous. The boreal forest alone, the great northern forest that sweeps from Newfoundland to the Yukon in an unbroken arc, is the largest intact forest ecosystem remaining on the planet. It covers more than 1 billion acres. It contains more standing trees than the Amazon rainforest, and it is, in practical human terms, almost completely inaccessible. A person who walks into this landscape unprepared does not necessarily die dramatically. They simply stop being findable. The forest is not hostile in the way a predator is hostile. It is indifferent. It continues. The seasons turn, the snow falls, the thaw comes, and whatever the forest has taken, it keeps. The search and rescue teams that operate in this country know this better than anyone. They will tell you, if you ask them, that finding a body in the Canadian wilderness is often harder than finding a living person. A body does not move. It does not emit heat. It does not signal. It simply lies, wherever it fell, and slowly becomes part of the landscape that surrounds it. This is the first piece of the answer to why Canada's missing numbers look the way they do. Geography. Pure, indifferent, overwhelming geography. But it is only the first piece, and it is the least interesting one. The more you look at the actual breakdown of who goes missing in Canada, the more the picture changes. Because the missing are not evenly distributed. They are not a random sample of the Canadian population, spread proportionally across demographics and regions and communities. They cluster. They concentrate in specific groups and specific places, with a consistency that cannot be explained by geography alone, and that tells a story far older and far darker than any modern policing failure could account for. Indigenous women and girls. That phrase, those 4 words, appear in almost every serious examination of the missing persons crisis in Canada, and they appear with a weight that most non-Indigenous Canadians still have not fully reckoned with. Indigenous women and girls in Canada go missing at rates that are, depending on which study you read and which methodology you accept, between 4 and 12 times higher than non-Indigenous women and girls. They are murdered at rates 6 times the national average. They are, in the language of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, the final report of which was released in 2019 after years of testimony, subject to what that inquiry explicitly called genocide. That is not a word that gets used lightly. That is not a word that appears in polite policy documents or cautious academic papers without a great deal of evidence, and a great deal of deliberate consideration. The commissioners who authored that report were not activists making rhetorical flourishes. They were judges and lawyers and experts in human rights law and international humanitarian law, and they looked at the evidence, and they used that word with full awareness of what it means and what it implies. But to understand why, to understand the mechanisms by which this particular pattern of disappearance came to exist and continues to exist, you have to go much further back than the statistics. You have to go back to the land itself, to what the land was before the word Canada existed, before the concept of a nation-state was applied to this territory, to what was here before the people who made the maps arrived to draw their lines. Because something happened in this land before recorded history. Something that most of the history taught in Canadian schools does not address, that most of the history taught anywhere in the English-speaking world does not address with anything approaching the depth it deserves. And that something is not gone. It is present in the landscape, in the communities, in the patterns of disappearance that repeat themselves year after year, in ways that should have stopped making sense a long time ago, but somehow never have. We are going to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning that starts with European contact in the 15th century, though we will get there. Not the beginning that starts with the last ice age, though we will get there too. We are going to go back to the oldest beginning that the evidence allows us to access, to the time before the time that history books acknowledge, to the deep past of this continent that stretches back not thousands, but tens of thousands of years, and that contains within it the keys to understanding almost everything that has happened since. The land that we now call Canada has been continuously inhabited by human beings for at least 15,000 years. Recent evidence suggests the actual time frame may be closer to 20 or 25,000 years, possibly longer. The original peopling of the North American continent is one of the great unsolved puzzles of human prehistory, and the more evidence accumulates, the stranger and more complicated that puzzle becomes. The traditional model, the one that most people learnt in school, goes something like this. During the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower than they are today because so much water was locked up in glaciers, a land bridge existed between Siberia and Alaska. This bridge, called Beringia, was not a narrow crossing but a broad, flat, grassy plain, hundreds of kilometers wide, capable of supporting large animal populations, and the human hunters who followed them. Around 13,000 years ago, groups of people crossed this bridge from Northeast Asia into North America, and they spread rapidly southward through an ice-free corridor that opened between the Great Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. And within a few thousand years, they had populated both North and South America. This is the Clovis first model, named after a distinctive style of spear point found near Clovis, New Mexico in the 1930s. For decades, it was the dominant scientific consensus, and it was taught as established fact in classrooms across North America. It is now known to be wrong, or at least significantly incomplete. The evidence against the Clovis first model has been accumulating for decades, and by now it is overwhelming. Archaeological sites have been found across North and South America that predate the Clovis culture by thousands of years. The site at Monteverde in southern Chile has been definitively dated to at least 14,700 years ago, more than 1,000 years before the ice-free corridor would have been passable. The Paisley Caves in Oregon contain human coprolites dated to more than 14,000 years ago. The Meadowcroft rock shelter in Pennsylvania has produced artifacts that some researchers date back 16,000 years or more. In 2021, fossilized human footprints were discovered at White Sands National Park in New Mexico and dated to between 21,000 and 23,000 years ago, placing human beings in North America during the last glacial maximum, when the Bering Land Bridge had not yet opened and the ice sheets were at their maximum extent. This last finding, the White Sands footprints, was particularly significant because it does not just push back the date of human arrival. It fundamentally disrupts the narrative of how and when people got here. If humans were in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, they did not come through the ice-free corridor. That corridor did not exist yet. They came by some other route, along some path that we have not yet fully mapped, through circumstances that our current models of prehistoric migration cannot fully explain. There is another possibility that researchers have been exploring with increasing seriousness. The Kelp Highway hypothesis proposes that the first Americans did not walk across a land bridge at all, but traveled by boat, moving southward along the Pacific coast, sustained by the abundant marine resources of the kelp forest ecosystem that extended in an unbroken chain from Northeast Asia down along the North American coast and all the way to South America. This route would have been passable even during the height of the last ice age, because while the land was covered in glaciers, the coastline was not, and the kelp forests provided food, and the boats provided mobility. There are problems with this hypothesis, most notably the fact that coastal sites from this era would now be underwater, having been swallowed by the sea level rise that followed the melting of the ice. Finding evidence for a coastal migration route is therefore extraordinarily difficult, because the evidence is at the bottom of the ocean. But the genetic and linguistic data increasingly supports a picture of the peopling of the Americas that is far more complex than a single migration across a single land bridge, involving multiple waves of migration from multiple source populations across multiple time periods, some of them arriving by sea and moving along coastlines, others arriving overland and moving through interior routes. What all of this means, in terms that matter for the story we are telling tonight, is that the indigenous peoples of North America are not recent arrivals. They are not a people who showed up a few thousand years before the Europeans and happened to be in the way. They are a people who have been here for an amount of time that exceeds the oldest civilizations in the Old World, who developed cultures and knowledge systems and relationships with this land over a span of time that dwarfs the entire history of Europe from the Roman Empire to the present day. And what they developed in that time was something that the European arrivals were almost entirely incapable of understanding, recognizing, or valuing, and that consequently they did not merely ignore, but actively worked to destroy. The knowledge systems of the indigenous peoples of what is now Canada are among the most sophisticated ecological intelligence frameworks ever developed by human beings. We are only beginning to understand this now, through the work of researchers who are finally listening to what indigenous knowledge holders have been saying for centuries, and through the application of scientific tools that are powerful enough to test the claims that oral traditions have been making all along. Consider the oral traditions of the Pacific Northwest Coast peoples, who tell stories about a time when the sea rose dramatically and swallowed land that had previously been above water. For a long time, these stories were interpreted by Western academics as mythology, as symbolic narratives not to be taken literally. Then researchers began looking at the geological record of sea level rise along the Pacific Northwest coast and discovered that the events described in those oral traditions correspond with remarkable precision to actual geological events that occurred between 7,000 and 10,000 years ago. The stories are not mythology, they are memory. They are accurate records of real events transmitted across hundreds of generations through the only technology available to a people without writing, the technology of story. This is what a 10,000-year relationship with a landscape looks like. Not a myth, not a fable, a memory so persistent and so precise that it survives the rise and fall of generations and the passage of geological time, and arrives, still accurate, in the mouths of people living in the 21st century. The indigenous peoples of Canada knew this land in ways that cannot be overstated. They knew the salmon runs and the berry cycles and the migration routes of every significant animal species across millions of square kilometers of territory. They knew the medicinal properties of hundreds of plants in precise pharmacological detail that Western science is still in the process of confirming. They knew the weather patterns and the ice conditions and the flood cycles of rivers that European surveyors could barely navigate with modern equipment. They knew where to walk and where not to walk, where the land was stable and where it would swallow you, where the water was drinkable and where it would make you sick, where the good stone for tools could be found, and how far you would have to travel to get it. This knowledge was not written down. It was carried in languages, in songs, in ceremonies, in stories, in the names of places. Every river, every lake, every hill, every bay in the territories of the indigenous peoples of Canada had a name, and that name contained information. Information about the nature of the place, about what had happened there, about what dangers it held or what gifts it offered. The landscape was a library, and the people who lived in it were its readers, its authors, and its keepers. And then European contact happened, and the process of destroying that library began. The history of European contact with the indigenous peoples of North America is not, in its broad outlines, unknown to most people. The broad strokes, colonization, disease, displacement, forced assimilation, are part of the curriculum, at least in their most sanitized form. What is less well known, less taught, less examined, is the sheer scale and the specific mechanisms of what happened, and what the relationship between those mechanisms and the current patterns of disappearance actually is. The first thing that happened when Europeans arrived in the territories, now comprising Canada, was disease. Not warfare, not deliberate extermination, though those came later. Disease. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had been geographically isolated from the disease pools of Europe, Asia, and Africa for at least 15,000 years. Their immune systems had no experience with smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus, cholera, or any of the dozens of other pathogens that Europeans carried with them as a matter of routine, and had developed at least partial immunological resistance to over generations of exposure. The result was catastrophic beyond any modern frame of reference. Estimates of pre-contact indigenous population sizes in the Americas vary enormously, but the most credible scholarly assessments suggest that the hemisphere was home to somewhere between 50 and 100 million people before European contact. By the year 1600, that population had been reduced by somewhere between 50 and 90%, depending on the region. In some areas, the reduction was even more extreme. Entire nations were effectively wiped out before any European had personally encountered them, the disease travelling ahead of the contact, moving through trade networks and seasonal gatherings, and the ordinary movements of people across the landscape. In the territories that would become Canada, this process was not uniform and not instantaneous. Different nations experienced contact at different times and with different intensities, but the demographic catastrophe was total. Populations that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands were reduced to tens of thousands. Knowledge systems that had required thousands of years to build were concentrated in the memories of a fraction of the people who had originally carried them. Languages that had evolved over millennia to encode the ecological intelligence of specific territories were suddenly spoken by so few people that a single bad winter, a single epidemic, a single military defeat could reduce a language's speakers to a number too small to sustain transmission to the next generation. This is not ancient history in the way that the extinction of the mammoth is ancient history. The last speakers of some of these languages died within living memory. Some are dying right now. The knowledge they carried, the intimate, detailed understanding of the land that took thousands of years to accumulate, is going out of the world in real time with every death of every elder who was never given the opportunity, or the resources, or the cultural safety to pass it on. But disease, as devastating as it was only the beginning. What followed was a systematic and deliberate campaign to finish what the disease had started, not by killing bodies, though killing happened, but by destroying the cultural infrastructure that gave those bodies meaning and connection and continuity. The residential school system, the Indian Act, the forced relocation of communities, the prohibition of ceremonies and languages, the systematic removal of children from their families, sometimes across multiple generations. These were not isolated incidents or the actions of a few bad actors. They were policies, deliberate, planned, legally mandated policies of the Canadian state carried out over more than a century, with the explicit stated goal of eliminating Indigenous identity. The phrase used at the time by the architects of these policies was to kill the Indian in the child. This is a quote. It is not an exaggeration or a paraphrase. It is what the people who designed these systems said they were trying to do, in official documents, in parliamentary speeches, in correspondence between government officials and church authorities. They said it clearly because they believed it was right. They believed that Indigenous culture was inferior, dangerous, and incompatible with the civilization they were building, and that the kindest thing they could do for Indigenous people was to destroy every aspect of who they were and replace it with something they found more acceptable. The residential school system operated in Canada from the 1870s to 1996. That is not the distant past. There are people alive today who attended residential schools. There are people alive today who had children taken from them and sent to residential schools. The last school closed when the internet already existed, when many of the people reading this were already alive. At these schools, children were forbidden to speak their languages. They were punished for practicing their cultures. They were separated from their families, sometimes for years at a time, sometimes permanently. They were subjected to neglect, physical abuse, and sexual abuse at rates that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which spent years documenting the history of these institutions, described as systemic and pervasive. The death rate at these schools, from tuberculosis, influenza, and other preventable illnesses that spread through overcrowded and underfunded facilities, was in some years higher than the death rate of Canadian soldiers serving in the First World War. At least 3,201 children are confirmed to have died in the residential school system. The actual number is almost certainly much higher because records were poorly kept, because some schools did not report deaths to the government, because some children were buried in unmarked graves on school grounds, and the graves were never mapped or recorded in any retrievable way. In 2021, ground-penetrating radar surveys at the former Kamloops Indian Residential School in British Columbia detected what appeared to be the remains of 215 children. Within months, similar surveys at other former school sites had identified hundreds more, thousands more, scattered across the country in unmarked graves that the schools had not bothered to document and that successive Canadian governments had not bothered to find. The discovery of those graves provoked a national reckoning that is still ongoing and still incomplete. But the graves, as terrible as they are not the end of the story. They are a symbol of something larger. They are the physical evidence of a process that did not end when the last residential school closed. The trauma that the residential school system created did not disappear because the schools closed. It was transmitted, the way all profound trauma is transmitted, through families, through communities, through the altered relationship with the world that comes from having been systematically taught that you are worthless, that your language is garbage, that your culture is filth, that the people who love you cannot protect you, that the authorities who are supposed to keep you safe are in fact the source of your suffering. This intergenerational trauma is not a metaphor. It is a documented, measurable, physiological reality. The children who survived the residential school system went home, when they were eventually allowed to go home, fundamentally altered. Many of them had never been parented in any functional sense, having been taken from their families before they had any experience of what normal family life looked like, having been subjected to abuse and neglect during what should have been the years of their formation. When they became parents themselves, they did not have the internal resources to parent their own children in the ways that children need, not because they did not love their children, but because the knowledge of how to do that, transmitted through family, through culture, through the thousands of small daily interactions through which one generation teaches another how to be human, had been deliberately severed. Add to this the ongoing structural conditions, the chronic underfunding of indigenous communities, the inadequate housing, the lack of access to clean water in many reserves, not for years, but for decades, the inadequate healthcare, the policing that responds to calls from indigenous communities at lower rates and with less urgency than it responds to calls from non-indigenous communities, the justice system that incarcerates indigenous people at rates that are, by any international standard, nothing short of shocking. Indigenous people make up approximately 5% of Canada's population. They make up 30% of the federal prison population. Indigenous women make up more than 40% of federally incarcerated women. None of this exists in isolation. All of it is connected. The poverty and the trauma and the inadequate infrastructure and the over-policing and the over-incarceration and the missing and the murdered, they are all expressions of the same underlying conditions. Conditions that were deliberately created over more than a century of policy and that are maintained, not through active malice in most cases, but through the inertia of systems that were built to do exactly what they are doing and that continue to do it long after the people who built them are gone. This is the context into which the missing persons crisis in Canada fits, not as an anomaly, not as a mystery to be solved through better search and rescue coordination or improved DNA databases, as a predictable, structural outcome of a set of historical processes that are still ongoing. But we have not yet talked about the places where people disappear. We have not yet talked about the geography of the missing, the specific landscapes that seem to hold their secrets with unusual tenacity, the corridors and waterways and stretches of road that appear again and again in the records of the disappeared. Because if you look at the data, not just demographically but geographically, something interesting and unsettling begins to emerge. The Highway of Tears. That is the name that the communities along Highway 16 inches, British Columbia, gave to the stretch of road running from Prince George to Prince Rupert, a distance of approximately 720 kilometers, through some of the most isolated terrain in the province. They gave it that name because of what has happened along it, because of the women, predominantly Indigenous women, who have gone missing or been found dead along that corridor for more than 4 decades. The official count of cases linked to the Highway of Tears begins in 1969. That is the year the first documented disappearance occurred, a young woman named Gloria Moody. Since then, depending on which definition of the corridor you use and which methodological standards you apply, between 18 and 43 women are confirmed to have gone missing or been murdered along that highway. Advocacy groups and families of the missing believe the actual number is higher, perhaps significantly higher, because cases involving Indigenous women have historically been deprioritized by law enforcement in ways that mean some disappearances were simply not investigated with the thoroughness required to conclusively link them to the corridor. To understand why the Highway of Tears is what it is, you have to understand what Highway 16 represents geographically and socially. The highway runs through the territories of multiple First Nations, connecting small communities to larger centers, winding through boreal forest and along river valleys that in many stretches are hours from the nearest town of any size. For the people who live in those communities and who need to travel to Prince George or Terrace or Smithers for medical appointments, for court dates, for shopping, for work, the highway is essential. And for much of its length, there is no public transportation. There is no bus. There is no train. There is nothing except the highway itself and the vehicles that travel it, and the people who stand at its edge and put out their thumbs because they have no other choice. Hitchhiking, which the rest of Canada effectively stopped doing decades ago because the combination of better transportation infrastructure and increased awareness of the dangers made it unnecessary, remains a necessity for many residents of the communities along the Highway of Tears. It is not a choice made in ignorance of the risks. It is a choice made because the alternative is not going, not getting medical care, not making it to court, not seeing family, not surviving. The missing women and girls of the Highway of Tears did not disappear because they were reckless or because they made bad decisions. They disappeared because they were poor, because they were Indigenous, because the infrastructure that would have protected them was not provided, and because the responses to their disappearances were shaped by the same systemic biases that had shaped every other interaction between those communities and the Canadian state. Police investigations into Highway of Tears disappearances have been criticised by families, by advocates, and by independent reviewers for being inadequate, for being delayed, for being conducted with assumptions and investigative priorities that would not have been applied to cases involving non-Indigenous victims. Tips were not followed up. Evidence was not preserved. Investigations were closed prematurely. Families were told things that turned out to be untrue. The RCMP's own internal reviews have acknowledged deficiencies in how these cases were handled. But the Highway of Tears is not unique. It is the most visible and most documented of what appear to be multiple such corridors across Canada, places where Indigenous women and girls have gone missing in clusters that defy random distribution, where the geography and the social conditions and the inadequacy of institutional response have combined to create environments in which violence can operate with relative impunity. The disappearance and murder of Indigenous women and girls is not a regional phenomenon. It is national. It spans every province. It spans both urban and rural environments. In Vancouver's downtown east side, which has been called the poorest urban postal code in Canada and which has a large Indigenous population, women went missing for years, some of them for decades, before the investigation into Robert Picton, a pig farmer in nearby Port Coquitlam, revealed that he had killed at least 49 women, and possibly many more, many of them Indigenous, many of them from the downtown east side. The investigation into the missing women had been hampered for years by the failure of the Vancouver Police Department and the RCMP to share information, by failures of jurisdiction, by the low priority accorded to missing women who were sex workers and drug users and Indigenous, by a systemic undervaluing of these women's lives that allowed a killer to operate for years before anyone treated the disappearances as the emergency they were. Robert Picton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder in 2007. He was charged with an additional 20 murders. Families of the missing believe the number of his victims was much higher than the 49 he boasted about, possibly as many as 60 or more. The RCMP's Project Even-Handed, which investigated the downtown east side missing women cases, reviewed files on 67 women who went missing between 1978 and 2001. Most of them were never found. Even with Picton in prison, even with the investigation formally concluded, most of those women remain missing, their fates unknown, their families left without answers. The Picton case, as significant as it was, did not change the fundamental conditions that produced it. The downtown east side remains one of the poorest urban neighbourhoods in Canada. Indigenous women remain overrepresented among its most vulnerable residents. The structural conditions of poverty, addiction, inadequate housing, and inadequate services remain, and women continue to go missing. This is the present day. This is Canada in the 21st century. But the story does not begin here. And to understand why it persists, why it cannot be solved through simply improving policing or increasing funding for missing persons units, you have to go back to the land and to what the land remembers. Because the land remembers things that the official history does not record. The land holds things that no database contains, and one of the most significant things the land holds is the memory of what this territory was before the concept of Canada existed, before the borders were drawn and the names were changed and the maps were made. The indigenous nations of what is now Canada did not live in isolation from one another. They maintained complex networks of trade and diplomacy and kinship across the continent. These networks followed routes that had been used for thousands of years, river systems and mountain passes and portage trails that the landscape itself had shaped over geological time. Goods moved along these routes. Ideas moved along these routes. People moved along these routes, and the movement of people meant the movement of knowledge, of culture, of genetic diversity, of all the things that a living civilization requires to sustain itself. Many of the highways and roads that now cross the Canadian landscape follow, with remarkable fidelity, the routes that Indigenous peoples travelled for thousands of years before them. The Trans-Canada Highway, in many of its stretches, follows river valleys and mountain passes that were significant travel routes for Indigenous peoples long before any European surveyor laid eyes on them. Highway 16, the Highway of Tears, follows the Skeena and Bulkley River corridors, which were among the most important travel and trade routes in the entire region for thousands of years. This matters for two reasons. The first is practical. These routes exist where they exist because they are the most navigable paths through difficult terrain, and that has been true for longer than any written record extends. The communities that exist along them exist where they exist in part because of the same geographical logic that made them important routes in the first place. The second reason is more difficult to articulate, and it touches on something that sits at the edge of what Western science is comfortable discussing, but that Indigenous knowledge systems have been clear about for as long as those knowledge systems have existed. Some places hold power, some places are dangerous. Some stretches of landscape have a quality that Indigenous peoples have described in various ways across various cultural traditions, but that consistently includes the idea that these places require specific knowledge and specific respect to navigate safely, and that navigating them without that knowledge and respect carries consequences. This is not mysticism, or rather, it is not only mysticism, it is also ecology, geology, and practical wisdom accumulated over thousands of years of living in intimate relationship with specific landscapes. The places that Indigenous oral traditions mark as dangerous are very often places that are genuinely dangerous in physically measurable ways. Places where the current in a river becomes unpredictable under specific conditions. Places where weather systems converge in ways that can produce rapid and dangerous changes. Places where the terrain is deceptive, where what looks like solid ground is not, where a false step in the wrong direction can take you somewhere from which there is no returning. Places where, for whatever combination of geographical and ecological reasons, human beings have been going missing for as long as anyone can remember, and where the land has always been understood to demand a particular kind of attention. The Highway of Tears passes through territory that the Wet'suwet'en, the Gitxsan, and other nations have inhabited for thousands of years. In the oral traditions of these nations, the river valleys and mountain passes of this region are not neutral geography. They are storied places, places with names that encode information about their character and their history, places that require a specific kind of relationship to navigate safely. The women who have gone missing along Highway 16 were moving through a landscape that their cultural traditions, where those traditions survived the residential school system intact enough to be transmitted, would have approached very differently than the way the highway asks you to approach it. They were moving alone, at night, without the knowledge of the specific places they were passing through that their grandmothers' grandmothers would have carried as a matter of course. They were moving through a landscape whose dangers, both human and geographical, had been stripped of context by the destruction of the knowledge systems that made that context available. And they were moving through a landscape in which human predators knew that the institutions which were supposed to protect them would not respond with the same urgency they would apply elsewhere. That intersection of geographical knowledge lost, of structural vulnerability enforced, and of institutional indifference maintained, is where people disappear. There is another aspect of the disappearances in Canada that receives far less attention than the cases of Indigenous women and girls, and that is the wilderness disappearances. The people who walk into the backcountry and do not come back. The hikers, the hunters, the prospectors, the people who went for a drive down a logging road on a Sunday afternoon and parked their truck at a trailhead and were never seen again. The people whose disappearances produce extensive, expensive, multi-week search and rescue operations that comb thousands of acres of wilderness and find nothing, not a footprint, not a piece of clothing, not a dropped water bottle. Nothing. Canada's search and rescue statistics are remarkable. The number of wilderness search and rescue operations conducted annually in this country runs into the thousands. British Columbia alone conducts more search and rescue operations each year than most small countries conduct in a decade. The majority of these operations find the missing person, alive or deceased, within the area they were expected to be. A hiker who got turned around, an elderly person with dementia who wandered from a care facility, a hunter who got caught by unexpected weather and built a shelter and waited it out. These are the ordinary missing, the ones whose disappearances follow a logic that search and rescue teams understand and can work with. But there is a subset of wilderness disappearance cases in Canada that does not follow that logic. Cases where the missing person was experienced, where conditions should not have been dangerous, where the area was well travelled and the terrain was well documented, where the person had every equipment and every preparation required, and yet simply ceased to exist within a landscape that offered no explanation for their absence. Researchers who have looked systematically at wilderness disappearance cases across North America, most notably the investigator and author David Paulides, who spent years compiling unusual disappearance cases from North America's national parks and wilderness areas, have identified patterns in these cases that are difficult to explain within conventional frameworks. Cases where dogs trained to follow human scent tracks lost the trail suddenly and completely, as if the person had simply ceased to leave any trace. Cases where a person disappeared within clear sight distance of companions and was never seen again. Cases where searchers swept an area multiple times and found nothing, then weeks later found remains in the same area that had already been thoroughly covered, in locations that the person should not have been able to reach, given their last known position and the time that had elapsed. These patterns appear with unusual frequency in specific geographic areas that tend to have certain characteristics in common: high elevation, proximity to bodies of water, weather patterns that can shift rapidly, terrain that disorients even experienced navigators. Areas where, not coincidentally, Indigenous oral traditions have historically marked the landscape as requiring particular care and particular knowledge. There is a specific geography of disappearance in Canada that, when you map it, produces clusters that cannot be explained solely by population density or recreational use patterns. Certain regions account for disproportionately high numbers of wilderness disappearances relative to both their size and their visitor traffic. Parts of the interior of British Columbia, the Mackenzie Valley Corridor, stretches of the Quebec Boreal, the Shield Country north of Lake Superior. These are not places where people are concentrated. They are places where, historically, people have gone and not returned at rates that exceed what you would expect from the terrain alone. The Indigenous peoples, who have lived in these territories for thousands of years, have stories about this. They have names for the phenomena that the Western tradition of wilderness disappearance investigation struggles to categorize. They have protocols developed over generations for moving through these landscapes safely, protocols that Western hikers and hunters and researchers do not know, because those protocols were part of the cultural knowledge that the residential school system and the broader project of colonization was specifically designed to eliminate. One of the most consistent elements in the oral traditions of multiple indigenous nations across Canada is the concept of places that are dangerous, not because of any physical feature of the landscape that a map would show, but because of a quality of the place that is difficult to translate into English without either over-dramatizing it or underselling it. The Ojibwe concept of Windigo country, the Cree concept of locations associated with certain kinds of spiritual danger, the belief, widespread across multiple First Nations and backed by generations of accumulated practical experience, that there are places in this landscape that you do not enter alone, that you do not enter without preparation, that you do not enter without knowing the specific protocols that make safe passage possible. Western researchers are, understandably, uncomfortable with this framework. It does not fit within the epistemological structures of scientific inquiry. You cannot design a controlled experiment to test whether a specific stretch of forest is dangerous in the way that indigenous oral traditions say it is dangerous. You cannot isolate the variable. You cannot falsify the hypothesis in the way that science requires. But you can look at the pattern. You can look at where people have been going missing for hundreds of years, across multiple generations, across the pre-contact and post-contact divide, across the period when the people who knew this land intimately were still here in sufficient numbers to maintain their knowledge, and the period after that knowledge was suppressed. And you can notice that some of those patterns are stable, that some of those places keep taking people regardless of the era, regardless of who is moving through them, regardless of whether the person who disappears is an indigenous trapper in 1840 or a recreational hiker with GPS technology in 2015. The landscape does not change. The geological features that made those places what they are have not changed, and the pattern of disappearance has not changed. What has changed is the availability of the knowledge that made it possible to navigate those places safely, and the structural conditions that determine who is sent into them without adequate preparation or support. There is a third category of disappearance in Canada that sits between the pattern of missing Indigenous women and girls and the pattern of wilderness disappearance, and that is the category of disappearances along the northern resource corridors. The pipelines, the mining roads, the logging roads, the remote industrial infrastructure that stretches across the Canadian north and brings men and money into territories that most Canadians never see and never think about. These corridors bring workers, and they bring other things too. They bring the particular social dynamics of isolated, predominantly male, predominantly transient workforces, far from their families and their home communities. They bring bars and alcohol and the specific forms of violence that arise when men are bored and isolated, and there is money moving and no sufficient social oversight. They bring traffic, not just the traffic of workers moving through, but the traffic that follows wherever there is money, the informal economies, the exploitation, the movement of vulnerable people into situations they cannot easily extract themselves from. Communities that previously had limited contact with the outside world suddenly have a road running through them and trucks running on that road around the clock and workers stopping and spending money. And the data on what happens to Indigenous women and girls in communities near major resource development projects is not encouraging. Multiple studies have documented elevated rates of violence against Indigenous women in the vicinity of industrial camps, elevated rates of trafficking, elevated rates of disappearance. The phenomenon has a name in the literature: man camps. The transient worker camps that spring up around major resource projects and that have been linked in data collected across multiple projects in both Canada and the United States to significant increases in violence against women in surrounding communities. This is not speculative. This is documented. This is in the reports of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. This is in academic studies published in peer-reviewed journals. This is in the testimony of community members who watched it happen and who tried to warn the regulators who approved the projects and who were not listened to. It is documented, and it continues to happen, because the economic interests that benefit from resource development are well organized and well resourced, and the communities that bear the costs are neither. So we have the historical trauma, the ongoing structural vulnerability, the geographical conditions, the inadequate institutional response, the movement of exploitative industries into isolated communities. These are the pieces of the explanation for why Canada's missing numbers look the way they do. They are not individually surprising. Each of them, taken alone, would explain some portion of the phenomenon. What makes the Canadian situation distinct is the way they combine the specific alchemy of those factors in the specific geography of this specific country, producing outcomes that are, by global standards, extraordinary. But there is one more dimension we have not yet explored, one more layer of the story that sits beneath the contemporary crisis and beneath even the colonial history, that goes back to the deep time of this continent and connects the present pattern of disappearance to something that happened here long before any of the European-derived frameworks we use to understand the modern world came into existence. To understand the pre-Columbian history of the territory that is now Canada, you have to first understand how much of it we do not know. The absence of written records from this period is not just a logistical inconvenience. It is a fundamental epistemological challenge that shapes every attempt to reconstruct what this continent looked like before European contact. Who was here, what they built, what they knew, and what happened to them. What we do have is the archaeological record, which is richer and stranger and more surprising than the textbooks suggest. And we have the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples, which scholars are only now beginning to take seriously as historical sources. And we have the genetic evidence, which is being revised with almost every new study. And we have the physical landscape itself, which holds in its soil and its stone and its water the evidence of everything that has happened in it for longer than human beings have been here to observe. Let us start with what the archaeological record tells us about the complexity of pre-contact North American civilization, because this is one of the most persistently underestimated stories in the history of human achievement. The textbook version of pre-Columbian North America, particularly the territories now comprising the United States and Canada, tends to describe a landscape of small, semi-nomadic bands of hunter-gatherers, with perhaps a few more settled agricultural communities in the southwest and along the Mississippi. This is not wrong, exactly, but it is so incomplete as to be functionally misleading. The full picture of what was here before European contact is far more complex, far more sophisticated, and in some respects, far more surprising than this version suggests. In the period archaeologists call the Woodland period, roughly 3,000 years ago to 1,200 years ago, the eastern half of North America was home to a series of complex, interconnected cultures that built earthworks on a scale that continues to astonish researchers. The Hopewell tradition, centered in what is now Ohio, and radiating outward through a trade network that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Great Plains to the Atlantic coast, built earthen structures that covered dozens of acres and were aligned with astronomical precision. The Great Newark earthworks in Ohio, which date to roughly 2,000 years ago, cover more than 4 square miles and include a perfectly circular enclosure, an octagonal enclosure, and a series of geometric earthen walls that were aligned to track the 18.6-year cycle of the Moon, with an accuracy that required sustained astronomical observation across multiple generations. The Poverty Point site in Louisiana, dating to roughly 3,500 years ago, features massive C-shaped earthen ridges arranged in concentric rows around a central plaza covering an area of more than 900 acres, all of it constructed by a people who did not have metal tools, who did not have the wheel, and who moved the millions of cubic yards of earth involved, using baskets and human muscle power alone. The scale of the Poverty Point construction is comparable to the pyramids of Egypt, though it is almost never discussed in the same breath. These traditions extended into what is now Canada. The Shield archaic culture, which occupied the Canadian Shield for thousands of years before European contact, left behind burial mounds and stone arrangements that have been documented across thousands of kilometers of territory. The Laurel culture of the Ontario and Manitoba Shield country built elaborate ceramic traditions and mortuary complexes that show clear connections to the Hopewell networks to the south. The peoples of the Pacific Northwest developed cultures of extraordinary complexity and artistic sophistication, building architecture, developing systems of surplus management and redistribution, creating oral traditions of extraordinary depth and beauty that were among the most sophisticated in the world at the time of European contact, and that were very nearly destroyed in the century that followed. The Mississippian culture, which rose to prominence around 800 years ago and collapsed before European contact, for reasons that are not fully understood, built cities, not metaphorical cities, actual urban centers. Cahokia, in what is now Illinois, was at its peak around the year 1100, the largest city north of Mexico, with a population estimated at between 10 and 20,000 people, a number that made it larger than contemporary London. It had a massive central pyramid called Monk's Mound, which contains more soil than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It had a planned urban grid, a sophisticated agricultural system, long-distance trade connections, and evidence of a complex social hierarchy. And then, around 1350, it was abandoned. Why was Cahokia abandoned? Why did the Mississippian culture collapse? These are questions that archaeologists are still actively researching, and the answers are not yet fully established. But the evidence points toward a combination of factors: climate change, a prolonged drought, possibly connected to the same medieval climate anomaly that affected European and Asian civilizations in the same period, internal social pressures, the specific kinds of political and economic stresses that accumulate in complex hierarchical societies when resources become constrained, perhaps epidemic disease, though this remains debated, perhaps warfare with neighboring peoples. The collapse of Cahokia and the Mississippian system was not instantaneous. It took generations. And during those generations, populations moved. People who had lived in cities and maintained complex agricultural systems and extensive trade networks dispersed into the surrounding landscape, became mobile, adapted to new conditions, and carried with them fragments of the knowledge and tradition of the civilization they had come from. The descendants of the Mississippian people became, over the following centuries, some of the nations that European explorers encountered when they arrived. Nations that had, within living memory, come from complex urban civilizations, but that had adapted to more mobile lifestyles in the centuries of disruption that preceded contact. In Canada specifically, the period between roughly 800 and 400 years ago was one of significant population movement and cultural transformation. The ancestors of the Iroquoian nations, who at the time of contact were maintaining large fortified villages and sophisticated agricultural systems in what is now Ontario and Quebec, appear in the archaeological record as having expanded northward during this period from a more southern homeland. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Iroquois League, which many historians regard as one of the most sophisticated political inventions in human history, a confederacy of 5, later 6, nations held together by a constitution, the Great Law of Peace, that emphasized consensus governance and the rights of women, appears to have been founded at some point between 500 and 1,000 years ago in response to a period of intense conflict and social disruption. The Great Law of Peace, which was transmitted orally through the Haudenosaunee for centuries and only written down after European contact, contains within it a sophisticated understanding of political theory, of the management of conflict between nations, of the rights of individuals within community, of the relationship between human governance and natural law, that historians of political thought who are willing to engage with it seriously have described as among the most advanced political documents produced by any civilization before the modern era. Benjamin Franklin studied it. The founders of the United States were aware of it. Some historians argue that it influenced the design of the federal system of the United States, though the extent of that influence remains debated. The point of all this is not simply to establish that the indigenous peoples of Canada were sophisticated. That should not need establishing. The point is to establish the scale of what was lost, the depth of the cultural and political and ecological intelligence that was present in this territory before European contact, and that was systematically dismantled in the centuries that followed, and to begin to suggest the relationship between that loss and the patterns of disappearance that we observe today. Because here is something that is not widely known, and that the research of the last several decades has been quietly and persistently establishing. The landscape of pre-Columbian North America was not wilderness. It was a managed landscape. It was a cultivated landscape. The great eastern forests that European settlers encountered and described as primeval and untouched were not untouched. They were the product of thousands of years of deliberate management through controlled burning, selective harvesting, the encouragement of certain species, and the suppression of others. The open, park-like quality of many of the eastern forests that early European travelers described, forests you could drive a carriage through, forests with no undergrowth, with clear sightlines, with grass growing between widely spaced trees, was not a natural feature of those forests. It was the result of regular burning by indigenous peoples, carried out on schedules and with techniques refined over centuries to produce specific ecological outcomes. When those people were removed from the landscape, when their knowledge was suppressed and their management practices were prohibited, the forests changed. They became denser, darker, more tangled. What European settlers had experienced as primeval nature was in fact a managed landscape, and what the landscape became after management was withdrawn was not more natural but less. Let us talk about specific cases, not statistics, not patterns in the aggregate. Individual human beings who walked into some version of the Canadian landscape and did not come back, whose stories carry within them the compressed weight of everything we have been discussing. In 1969, a 16-year-old girl named Gloria Moody set out to travel along what would become the Highway of Tears. She was Tsimshian, from a community along the Skeena River. She was young and she was traveling, and she never arrived where she was going. Her case is considered the first documented Highway of Tears disappearance, the opening of a record that would accumulate for the next 5 decades. What happened to Gloria Moody is not known. No one was ever charged. The case was not investigated with the rigor that a case involving a 16-year-old white girl from a suburban community would have been investigated. And this is not a speculative claim. It is a pattern documented so consistently across so many cases that it was the central finding of multiple independent reviews of how law enforcement handled Highway of Tears cases. In 1989, a woman named Ramona Wilson disappeared from the Morristown Reserve, also along the Highway of Tears corridor. She was found in 1994, 5 years after her disappearance, at the Smithers Airport. No one was ever charged. Her family spent those 5 years not knowing. Her family spent those 5 years being told by investigators that she had probably just run away, a characterization that her family rejected from the beginning, and that the eventual discovery of her remains proved definitively false. In 2002, a 15-year-old girl named Nicole Hoare disappeared after hitchhiking along Highway 16 from Prince George towards Smithers. She was not Indigenous. She was a tree planter, a young woman from a middle-class family in Red Deer, Alberta. Her disappearance received national media attention in a way that the disappearances of Indigenous women along the same corridor had not. Her face was on milk cartons. There were major news stories. There was extensive pressure on police to act, and yet she too has never been found. She remains missing. Her case, and the contrast between the media attention it received and the attention that the disappearances of Indigenous women along the same route had historically received, prompted a significant amount of public discussion about the disparity in how these cases were treated. That discussion has not resolved the underlying disparity. Studies of media coverage of missing persons cases in Canada have consistently found that cases involving white victims receive significantly more coverage than cases involving Indigenous victims, that cases involving young women from middle-class backgrounds receive more coverage than cases involving women from marginalized communities, and that this disparity in coverage translates into disparity in public pressure on investigators and in the resources devoted to investigations. This is not a guess. It has been measured systematically over years of data. In 2011, a 17-year-old girl named Serena Abotswe, who had gone missing from Vancouver's downtown east side years earlier, was confirmed through DNA evidence to have been among the victims of Robert Pickton. Her family had been looking for answers for almost a decade. The answers came in the form of DNA from a pig farm. These are not aberrations. These are not exceptional cases that stand out against a background of functional, institutional response. These cases are representative. They represent how this system has worked, and in many ways continues to work, for the people who are most vulnerable within it. Now let us take a different kind of case. In 2019, a 44-year-old experienced outdoorsman named Matthew Fortin disappeared in the Gatineau Park area near Ottawa while on what was supposed to be a short hiking trip. Fortin was not a novice. He was familiar with the area. The weather was manageable. The terrain was not extreme. He walked into the park and he did not come back. Extensive searches over multiple days, covering the area he was known to be hiking in, found nothing. His remains were eventually found approximately 6 weeks later in an area that searchers had covered multiple times during the initial search, roughly 1.5 kilometers from where he was last known to be. The discovery raised significant questions. Not because there was any suggestion of foul play, but because experienced searchers had reportedly been over the area where he was found during the initial search and had found nothing, no trace. Cases like Fortin's are more common in Canada's wilderness than the public generally knows. Cases where the combination of factors, experience, manageable conditions, familiar terrain, and still, somehow, complete disappearance does not fit any straightforward explanation. Cases where the search is thorough and finds nothing, and then the remains appear in a location that was already searched, as if they were not there before. Cases that search and rescue professionals, if you get them talking off the record, will tell you that they find genuinely difficult to explain within their existing frameworks. There are theories. The most mainstream is something called the mattress effect, or search area saturation, the idea that in dense wilderness, even thorough searches can miss a stationary object due to visual obstruction and the psychological factors that affect how searchers process information under stress. This is real. It happens. It explains some cases. It does not explain all of them. There is another theory, less mainstream and significantly more uncomfortable, that has been advanced by researchers who have spent years looking at clusters of unusual wilderness disappearances across North America. The theory is that there are geographic hotspots, specific areas with specific characteristics, where disappearances occur at statistically anomalous rates, and that these hotspots correlate with certain features of the landscape, including elevation, proximity to water bodies of particular types, and certain geological characteristics. The theoretical mechanisms proposed to explain this correlation range from the mundane, specific terrain features that create navigational hazards, to the speculative, electromagnetic anomalies, to the actively unexplained, which is to say that some researchers have documented the correlation without proposing a mechanism because they do not have a mechanism to propose. This sits in uncomfortable territory for anyone who wants to think clearly and empirically about it. On one side, you have a pattern that appears to be real, documented, and consistent. On the other side, you have the absence of any conventional explanation that fully accounts for it. In between, you have the testimony of Indigenous knowledge holders who have been saying for generations that some of these places are dangerous in ways that Western science does not have adequate categories for, and who have been largely ignored. The question is not whether we should accept explanations that science cannot currently validate. The question is whether the absence of a validated explanation should lead us to dismiss patterns that the data clearly shows. The pattern of disproportionate disappearance in specific geographic areas is not in question. The explanation for that pattern remains open. What is also not in question is this. The people who knew the most about those landscapes, who had the deepest and most intergenerationally tested understanding of where the dangers were and how to navigate them, were systematically deprived of the ability to transmit that knowledge and systematically excluded from the decisions about who would pass through those places and under what conditions. The connection between that deprivation and the pattern of disappearance is not speculative. It is structural and historical and ongoing. There are researchers and advocates who have spent careers trying to change this, trying to ensure that indigenous knowledge is treated as the expert knowledge that it is, trying to integrate traditional ecological knowledge into land management, into search and rescue protocols, into the planning of the infrastructure that crosses these territories. Some progress has been made. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which Canada endorsed and then formally implemented in law in 2021, creates a framework for the free, prior, and informed consent of Indigenous peoples to projects that affect their territories and for the respect of their rights to maintain and develop their cultural practices and to transmit their knowledge to future generations. Whether this framework is implemented with the depth and the sincerity that it requires remains to be seen. What the Declaration does not address is the knowledge that has already been lost, the languages that have already fallen silent, the elders who have died without being able to pass on what they knew, the generations of children who grew up in residential schools without the cultural formation that would have made them keepers of that knowledge. That knowledge is not gone in its entirety. There are language revitalization programs and cultural reclamation efforts and dedicated communities working with extraordinary effort and skill to recover and reconstruct and pass on what survived. But the scale of what was lost exceeds what can be recovered in a generation or even several generations. The gap between the knowledge that was here before contact and the knowledge that exists today is not a gap that can be closed quickly, and the consequences of that gap are measured in missing persons files and in unmarked graves and in families that have been waiting for answers for decades. There is a place in northern Ontario called the Pukasqua Coast. It runs along the north shore of Lake Superior for roughly 120 kilometres, and it is one of the most remote and challenging stretches of backcountry in the entire country. The Pukasqua Coastal Trail, which follows this coastline, is considered one of the most technically demanding multi-day hikes in Canada. It requires the ability to scramble over massive granite outcroppings, to ford swift-flowing rivers at crossings that can become impassable during high water, to navigate terrain that throws away the concept of a maintained trail and replaces it with the concept of finding your own way through a landscape that does not particularly care about your plans. The Ojibwe peoples have lived along this coastline and in the surrounding territory for thousands of years. The name Pukasqua in Ojibwe is not entirely agreed upon in its translation. Various sources give various meanings. Some say it refers to people cooking over a fire. Some say it refers to the violent, unpredictable nature of the lake. Some say it refers to something darker, something that was here before the Ojibwe arrived, something the name is a warning about. Lake Superior itself is extraordinary in ways that statistics can begin to convey but cannot fully capture. It is the largest freshwater lake in the world by surface area. It contains more water than all the other Great Lakes combined, plus 3 additional Lake Eries. It is large enough to create its own weather systems. Storms can form on its surface with a speed and intensity that surprises even experienced mariners. Its water temperature, even in summer, is cold enough to cause cold shock. The involuntary gasping and muscle paralysis that overcomes swimmers who fall into cold water suddenly, within minutes. People who fall into Lake Superior do not float. The cold prevents the decomposition that would normally cause a body to eventually rise to the surface. The lake keeps what it takes. The Ojibwe have a saying, "Gitchi Gumi never gives up its dead." The Great Sea does not return what it receives. This is not mythology. It is a meteorological and hydrological fact that experienced lake mariners have understood for as long as they have been navigating its waters. The lake keeps its dead because the water is too cold for decomposition, because the currents at depth do not bring things to the surface the way shallower bodies of water do, because the storms that cross its surface scatter whatever they claim across hundreds of kilometers of open water. Ships have gone down in Lake Superior, whose wrecks were not found for decades. People have drowned in Lake Superior, and their bodies have never been recovered. This is one of the oldest lakes in the world, one of the oldest open expanses of fresh water, and its deepest water has not been disturbed in ways that would bring old sediment to the surface since before the last ice age. What lies on the bottom of Lake Superior, in its deepest sections, is old in ways that most bodies of water are not, and around its shores, in the territory that the Ojibwe and their predecessors have inhabited for thousands of years, the evidence of pre-contact occupation extends back further than anywhere else in the Great Lakes region. The Pukasqua pits, which are found in concentrated numbers along the north shore of Lake Superior, and whose function has been debated by archaeologists for decades, are among the most intriguing features of this landscape. They are shallow oval depressions in the bedrock, roughly 1 to 2 meters wide and a half-meter deep, lined with rounded cobbles and typically located just above the high water line along the rocky shoreline. Thousands of them have been documented. No one is entirely certain what they were used for. Some theories suggest they were used for vision quests, for ritual isolation, for the kind of deliberate spiritual work that required physical containment and sensory limitation. Others suggest they may have been used for practical purposes, as fish traps, as storage pits, as structural elements of shelters. The most likely answer is that they served multiple purposes over the thousands of years that people lived along this coast, and that different pits in different periods served different functions. What is clear from the density and the distribution of the pits is that this coastline was intensively used by human beings over a very long period of time. The oral traditions of the Ojibwe speak of this coast as a place of power and of danger in equal measure, a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and something other is thinner than it is elsewhere, a place that rewards attention and punishes carelessness in ways that exceed what the physical terrain alone would explain. People disappear along this coast, not at dramatic rates, because not many people go there, it being genuinely remote and genuinely challenging. But when people disappear there, they tend to disappear completely. The cold water of the lake takes whatever enters it and does not give it back, and the granite terrain of the coast holds its secrets without expression. We do not have a good framework for integrating what the Ojibwe oral traditions say about this landscape with what the search and rescue data says about it. We have two bodies of knowledge, one developed over thousands of years of intimate practical experience, and one developed over a few decades of systematized incident reporting, that are pointing at the same phenomenon from different directions and speaking about it in languages that have not yet been translated into each other. This is the deeper challenge, the one that sits beneath the structural and historical and political dimensions of the missing persons crisis, the challenge of knowledge integration, the challenge of taking seriously, with the full weight of scientific rigor, the expertise that survived in the oral traditions of the peoples who lived in these landscapes for thousands of years, and treating that expertise as the data source it is, and allowing it to inform how we understand the geography of disappearance, and the conditions that make disappearance possible, and the interventions that might reduce it. This is not a simple challenge. It requires a depth of cultural humility and institutional willingness that has historically been almost entirely absent from the institutions involved. But it is the challenge, and the degree to which it is or is not met will determine whether the patterns of disappearance that have characterized this country for decades continue, or whether something begins to change. We are at a moment when the theoretical possibility of that change exists to a greater degree than it has at any previous point in the history of this country. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls produced 231 calls for justice, specific recommendations addressed to governments, to institutions, to corporations, and to individuals. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission produced 94 calls to action. The implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples through federal legislation creates legal obligations. There is more political and public will, at least at the level of stated intention, than there has been before. Whether that will translate into actual change at the pace and scale required is a different question, and the communities that have been waiting the longest for change have the most experience of the gap between stated intention and structural reality. They have seen many national reckoning moments before. They have seen the promises made in the wake of each one, and they have seen the promises fade as public attention moved on and the inertia of systems built to do things differently reasserted itself. The missing are not waiting for history. Their families are not waiting for the slow arc of institutional change. They are living inside the gap between what was promised and what was delivered, between what is known and what has been acted upon, between the documented reality of why this happens and the political will to actually change the conditions that make it happen. This is where the story sits, tonight, right now, in real time, not in the safely distant past, not in the abstract landscape of policy and statistics, in the present, in the ongoing reality of lives lost and families fractured, and communities bearing the weight of a crisis that the country has acknowledged but not yet solved. In the deep winter of 2022, a woman named Florence Spavia, 63 years old, an elder from the Cowessess First Nation in Saskatchewan, walked out into a storm near her community and did not come back. She was found 3 days later, a short distance from her home. She was one of the Indigenous elders whose passing represents not just a personal loss, but a loss of knowledge, of language, of the accumulated, practical and spiritual expertise of a lifetime spent in relationship with a specific piece of land. Her community mourned her. The country did not particularly notice. Every week, somewhere in Canada, this happens. A person is lost. A person disappears. Sometimes they are found. Sometimes they are not. And the total, accumulated weight of these disappearances, compressed into a number, 100,000 reported missing per year, is staggering, and is not staggering because the number has been stable long enough that it has become background noise. We need to hear it differently. We need to understand it differently. We need to hold the number against the history that produced it, and the geography that contains it, and the knowledge that was lost, and the structural conditions that were created, and that continue to be maintained. And we need to ask not just how we find the missing, but how we change the conditions under which they go missing in the first place. The answer to that question is long and difficult and expensive and politically complicated, and involves confronting things about the history and the present of this country that the country has been extremely reluctant to fully confront. But the answer exists. It is not a mystery. It is not beyond reach. It requires the kind of sustained, systemic, politically serious attention that every other national crisis of this scale eventually demands and eventually receives. The question is when. The question is whether enough people understand what is actually happening and why, and whether that understanding translates into the political will that change requires. Those are questions about the future. Tonight we are dealing with the past and the present, with the deep history and the structural reality, and the individual human beings who are somewhere in the landscape of this country, missing, their stories not yet concluded. To understand the full scale of the pre-contact civilization of North America, and consequently the full scale of what was lost, you have to go to a place that most visitors to the area walk past without any real comprehension of what they are looking at. You have to go to the river bottoms of the Ohio River Valley, or the floodplains of the Mississippi, or the ancient shorelines of the Great Lakes, and you have to look at the ground. The ground, in these places, is not what it looks like. It is not simply earth and grass and the detritus of nature. It is, in many cases, the remains of deliberate human construction, earthworks, mounds. The physical evidence of civilizations that built on a scale comparable to anything in the ancient world, and that have been so thoroughly absorbed into the landscape by centuries of agricultural clearance and urban development, that most people living near them have no idea what is beneath their feet. The mound-building cultures of North America are among the most poorly represented peoples in the standard historical narrative. They appear briefly in school curricula, if they appear at all, usually as a parenthetical note about the Mississippians, before the course moves on to the European exploration. What they actually were, in terms of social complexity, political organization, and cultural achievement, is almost never examined with the depth the evidence demands. The poverty point culture, which we mentioned earlier, dates to roughly 1,700 BCE. That puts it in the same temporal range as the Middle Kingdom of Egypt, as the mature phase of the Indus Valley civilization, as the late phase of Stonehenge's construction. These were not primitive people living in an empty continent. They were people building monumental architecture at the same time as every other civilization that Western education treats as foundational. The Hopewell interaction sphere, which began around 100 BCE and reached its peak around 200 CE, created a continent-wide network of exchange and cultural interaction that stretched from the Rocky Mountains to the Atlantic coast and from Hudson Bay to the Gulf of Mexico. Hopewell burial mounds contain copper from the Great Lakes, obsidian from the Rockies, mica from the Appalachians, shark teeth from the Gulf of Mexico, grizzly bear teeth from the Western Plains. The material traveled thousands of miles through exchange networks that presuppose sophisticated social infrastructure, political relationships, and cultural frameworks for managing long-distance interaction. The Mississippian culture that emerged around 800 CE and built Cahokia was not simply a regional phenomenon. At its peak, Mississippian settlements stretched from Wisconsin to the Gulf Coast, from the Great Plains to the Atlantic Piedmont. The influence of Mississippian culture in pottery styles, in ceremonial practices, in architectural forms, can be traced across an enormous geographic area. And when it collapsed, the ripples of that collapse were felt across the entire eastern half of the continent. In Canada, the connections to these southern networks were real and substantial. The Huron-Wendat Confederacy, which occupied the territory between Georgian Bay and Lake Simcoe at the time of early European contact, were part of the broader Iroquoian cultural tradition that had connections extending far to the south. Their agricultural system, their longhouse architecture, their political organization, all show the influence of centuries of interaction with the mound-building cultures to their south and southwest. The neutral nation, which occupied the territory between the Huron and the Haudenosaunee, and which maintained a deliberate diplomatic neutrality between those competing confederacies, was perhaps the most sophisticated practitioner of the kind of political balancing act that kept the complex, multinational landscape of pre-contact Eastern North America from constant warfare. Most of this is not in the school curriculum. Most of it is not in the popular understanding of pre-contact North America. And the absence of it from the popular understanding has consequences, because it shapes how people think about what was lost in the colonial process, and consequently, how they evaluate what needs to be restored. If you think the indigenous peoples of North America were small bands of hunter-gatherers living in a state of nature, with no complex social organization, no sophisticated governance, no architectural achievement, no intellectual tradition, then you might be tempted to think that what colonial policy did was displace a primitive people from territory they were not using effectively, and replace them with a modern civilization that built something where there was nothing. This is wrong, but it is a comfortable wrong, and it has been maintained by a century and more of selective education and deliberate myth-making. If you understand that the indigenous peoples of North America had, over thousands of years, built civilizations of genuine complexity and sophistication, that they had developed governance systems, ecological management systems, trade networks, knowledge systems, that represented enormous accumulated human achievement, then the colonial process looks very different. It looks like the destruction of something that actually existed and had value, and that the world is genuinely poorer for losing. The missing persons crisis in Canada is, among many other things, the ongoing echo of that destruction. The women who go missing along the Highway of Tears are not going missing in an empty landscape with no history. They are going missing in a landscape that was intimately known and carefully managed by their ancestors, in which their ancestors maintained systems of knowledge and movement and protection that would have made their disappearance much less likely if those systems had not been systematically dismantled. They are going missing in a landscape that the broader Canadian society still largely understands as wild and empty, as a place without history and without knowledge, rather than as a deeply storied territory whose history and knowledge were stolen along with everything else. The wilderness disappearances, the hikers and hunters who walk into the Canadian backcountry and do not come back, are happening in a landscape that is not actually wilderness in the sense of a place without human history. Every stretch of Canadian backcountry, from the Rockies to the Maritimes, from the Shield to the subarctic, has been inhabited and travelled and known by human beings for longer than the concept of wilderness itself has existed. The trails that are now walked by recreational hikers follow routes that indigenous peoples have used for thousands of years. The hazards that catch modern visitors by surprise were known and named and accounted for in the knowledge systems of the peoples who lived there before. The fact that modern hikers and hunters do not have access to that knowledge is not a sign that the knowledge does not exist. It is a sign that the knowledge was taken from the people who had it, and that we have not yet found an adequate way to restore it. There is a researcher at the University of Victoria named Pamela Kaur, whose work on the integration of Indigenous knowledge into British Columbia's environmental assessment processes has documented something remarkable. When Indigenous knowledge holders from the Tsimshian and Gitxsan nations were consulted about proposed industrial development projects in the Skeena watershed, they consistently identified specific locations that they described as culturally significant and ecologically sensitive. When independent environmental assessments of those same locations were conducted using Western scientific methods, they independently confirmed that the locations the Indigenous knowledge holders had identified were indeed ecologically significant, that they contained features or processes that made them sensitive to disturbance in ways that the Indigenous oral traditions had been describing for generations. The correlation between what the traditional knowledge identified and what the scientific assessment confirmed was not perfect. It was not complete, but it was consistent and statistically significant, and not at all explainable by coincidence. The knowledge was real. The knowledge was accurate. The knowledge had survived in oral tradition for long enough that it could still be applied to current conditions and found to be valid. Consider the Yukon. Consider what the Yukon is, geographically and historically, and consider what it tells us about everything we have been discussing. The Yukon covers 482,000 square kilometers, roughly the size of Spain. Its population is approximately 45,000 people. This means that the Yukon contains almost 4/5 the land area of Spain, for roughly the population of a medium-sized European town. It is one of the least densely populated jurisdictions in the world that is not actively uninhabitable. People live there, towns exist, roads connect some of them, but the vast majority of the territory is accessible only by river, by small aircraft, or on foot, and much of it has never been systematically surveyed by any Western scientific or administrative authority. What has been surveyed is remarkable. The Yukon is one of the few places in North America where Pleistocene megafauna remains are regularly found in good condition. The permafrost has preserved, with extraordinary fidelity, the remains of mammoths, giant bison, Yukon horses, and other Ice Age animals in conditions so good that scientists have been able to extract viable DNA, analyze stomach contents, and in some cases, identify the exact season in which an individual animal died. In 2018, a gold miner working in the permafrost near Dawson City found the preserved remains of a caribou calf that died approximately 4,400 years ago. In 2020, in the same region, a wolf pup was found with its fur, its paws, and its internal organs all intact, preserved by the permafrost for 57,000 years. The permafrost is a time capsule, but it is a time capsule that is opening because the permafrost is thawing. Climate change, which is affecting the Arctic and subarctic at approximately 3 to 4 times the rate of the global average, is causing the permafrost that underlies much of the Yukon to melt in ways and at rates that have no precedent in the human historical record. The thaw is exposing things that have not been at the surface for thousands of years. Things that were placed in the permafrost by geological processes, or by human beings, or by the ordinary deaths of animals, and that now, as the frozen ground releases them, are coming back into the world. In some cases, what the thaw is releasing is genuinely concerning from a public health perspective. The permafrost has preserved organic material, including the remains of animals and people, for thousands of years. In that material, potentially, are pathogens, bacteria and viruses that have been frozen and inactive for millennia, and that may still be capable of causing disease when exposed to warmth and moisture. The anthrax outbreak in the Yamal Peninsula of Siberia in 2016, which killed reindeer and sickened people, was linked to the thaw of permafrost that had preserved anthrax spores from animals that died more than 70 years earlier. Researchers have been warning for years that the thaw of deep permafrost could potentially expose pathogens for which modern human populations have no immunity, because those pathogens have not been active in the human environment for longer than human immune systems have had any exposure to them. This is speculative in its most alarming forms, but the general principle is established. The permafrost holds old things, and the old things it holds are not only harmless. For the First Nations peoples of the Yukon, the First Nation of Nachonyakdun, the Trondek-Hwekin, the White River First Nation, the Kluane First Nation, and others, the thaw of the permafrost is not just a scientific phenomenon. It is a cultural and spiritual disruption. The land is changing in ways that are inconsistent with how their oral traditions describe it, in ways that the knowledge systems developed over thousands of years of living with this specific climate did not have to account for, because the climate has not been this warm in the entire period of human habitation of the territory. The protocols for managing specific landscapes were developed in relationship with a specific climate. That climate is changing faster than oral tradition can adapt to it. This creates a new dimension of the knowledge gap problem. Even where traditional ecological knowledge has survived the colonial assault with some degree of integrity, even where elders have been able to transmit the knowledge of specific landscapes to younger generations, that knowledge may now be partially out of date. The permafrost that used to be reliable is not reliable. The river crossings that were safe at certain seasons are not safe. The weather patterns that could be read from specific signals are changing. The landscape is becoming, in some respects, a new landscape, one that requires new knowledge that does not yet exist because it cannot be developed on a timescale faster than the changes are occurring. The people who will have to navigate this new landscape, who will have to develop the new knowledge while also trying to preserve the old knowledge and manage the ongoing consequences of colonial trauma and structural underfunding, are the First Nations communities of the Yukon and the broader Canadian North. They will do this, as their ancestors have done every significant challenge, through cooperation and ingenuity and the application of accumulated wisdom to new problems. But they will do it without the resources and the institutional support that the scale of the challenge requires, unless the broader society recognizes what is happening and responds with something commensurate to the actual need. Because the Yukon is not just the Yukon, it is a proxy for everything we have been discussing at the largest scale, a vast, ancient landscape, a deep history of human habitation and knowledge, a colonial disruption of extraordinary thoroughness, an ongoing pattern of disappearance, a knowledge gap that has real, measurable consequences, and a rapidly accelerating environmental change that is making all of it more urgent. Somewhere in the Yukon, right now, there are missing people. Some of them are people who walked into the backcountry and did not return, whose families are waiting for news that the vastness of the territory makes very unlikely to come. Some of them are Indigenous people, men and women and children, whose disappearances reflect the same structural conditions that produce the same pattern everywhere in the country. Some of them are people whose stories are not currently known, whose disappearances have not yet been formally documented, who exist in the gap between what is missing and what is known to be missing. The Yukon's missing person statistics are, per capita, among the highest of any jurisdiction in Canada. This is not surprising given the geography and the demographics and the structural conditions we have described. But it is important. Because the Yukon is where these conditions are most purely concentrated, where the ratio of vulnerable people to available institutional support is most starkly unfavourable, where the landscape is most unforgiving and most capable of absorbing what enters it without trace. The Yukon is also, in some ways, where the relationship between Indigenous knowledge and Western scientific capacity is most actively being worked through. The First Nations of the Yukon are unusually well organized politically, having been among the first in Canada to conclude comprehensive land claim and self-government agreements with the federal government, agreements that give them significant authority over their territories and significant resources to exercise that authority. This does not solve the deep structural problems we have described, but it provides a framework within which the work of knowledge integration and structural change has more political and legal support than in many other parts of the country. Whether that framework produces the outcomes required is something that will be determined not by the legal text of agreements, but by the political will and the institutional capacity to implement them, and by the ongoing relationship between the First Nations governments and the various agencies and corporations and other governments that share authority over the territory. That relationship is imperfect. It is contested. It requires constant renegotiation. But it exists in a way that many other relationships between Indigenous nations and the institutions that affect their lives do not. This is important to hold on to as we work through the darkness of this history. There are places where the work is happening. There are communities where knowledge is being preserved and transmitted and applied. There are researchers and advocates and policymakers and community members who are doing the difficult, unglamorous, daily work of trying to change the conditions that produce the patterns we have been discussing. The work is real. The progress is real, if slower and more uneven than it needs to be. The missing, in the end, are not just a problem to be solved. They are a question being posed to the country. A question about what this place is, what it has been, what was done here and what is still being done here, and what kind of place it is capable of becoming. The answer to that question is not determined by history, even by a history as heavy and as present as this one. It is determined by the choices made in the present, by the allocation of attention and resources and political will, by the degree to which the people with the power to change things choose to exercise that power in ways commensurate with the scale of what is needed. Those choices are being made every day in legislatures and in police stations and in boardrooms and in community halls. They are being made by people who have read the reports and the recommendations and who know what needs to happen and who make the choice to act or to delay, to allocate resources or to defer them, to listen to the communities bearing the weight of this history or to treat their testimony as a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be addressed. The missing are watching. Or rather, the families of the missing are watching. They have been watching for a long time. They know what they are waiting for. They are waiting for the choices to change. There is a concept in the oral traditions of several Indigenous nations across Canada that translates, inadequately, as the idea that the land itself is a being, not a metaphor for a being, not an analogy for a living system. A being with memory and intention and the capacity to respond to how it is treated. This concept is expressed differently in different traditions and at different levels of literalness or abstraction. But it appears, in some form, across an enormous range of Indigenous cultures, and it has a specific implication for how those cultures understand the relationship between people and landscape that is relevant to what we have been discussing. If the land is a being, then the relationship between human beings and the land is a relationship between beings. It has obligations on both sides. It requires maintenance. It can be damaged. It can, in some traditions, become hostile when those obligations are not met, when the relationship is broken, when the maintenance fails. The land that was known and tended and respected and navigated with the specific protocols developed over thousands of years of relationship becomes something different, something more dangerous. When those protocols are withdrawn and the relationship is severed, this is a philosophical framework that Western science does not have the tools to evaluate in the terms in which it is expressed. You cannot design an experiment to test whether a specific stretch of boreal forest is angry, but you can look at what happens when the knowledge and the protocols that were developed in relationship with that stretch of forest are withdrawn, and you can note that what happens is that people start disappearing from it at rates that exceed what the physical terrain alone would predict. The correlation does not establish causation, but the correlation is real. And the framework that the oral traditions provide for understanding it is at least as plausible as any purely materialist account of why specific places in specific landscapes produce specific patterns of disappearance over many generations. There is also something specific that happens to people's perception of landscape when they move through it without the frameworks of knowledge and relationship that make it legible. The forest does not have to be literally hostile for the absence of knowledge to make it functionally more dangerous. You do not have to believe that the land is a being to understand that moving through a landscape without understanding it makes you vulnerable to the landscape in ways that you would not be if you understood it. The rivers that the Ojibwe know by their moods and their seasonal characters and their specific dangerous moments are rivers that a person who does not have that knowledge will approach as simply rivers, and they will not know what to watch for, and sometimes what they do not know will kill them. This is the most concrete and least controversial version of the argument. The landscape of Canada contains genuine dangers that were known and encoded in the knowledge systems of the peoples who lived there, and that are not known in the same way, or to the same depth, by the people who now move through those landscapes without that knowledge. The disappearances that result are, in a very literal sense, the cost of the knowledge gap. But there is another dimension to the geography of disappearance in Canada that resists even this explanation. It is the dimension that sits in the open space between what we can explain and what we cannot, and that the people who work in wilderness, search and rescue, if they are honest about it, will acknowledge exists. In 2017, a study published in the journal Wilderness and Environmental Medicine analyzed the characteristics of over 3,000 wilderness disappearances in national parks and other federal lands across North America. The study found patterns that the authors described as statistically anomalous and difficult to explain within existing models. Disappearances clustered near water features, not in the way you would expect from drowning risk, but in a broader way, including in areas where the terrain did not present obvious water hazards. Disappearances clustered in areas of high elevation, again beyond what terrain difficulty alone would predict. And disappearances occurred with notable frequency in conditions that search and rescue professionals described as unusual, conditions where the missing person was experienced, where the terrain was familiar, where nothing about the circumstances should have led to the outcome that occurred. The study did not propose an explanation for these patterns. The authors were careful to note that their finding was descriptive rather than causal, that they had identified patterns without identifying mechanisms. But the patterns they described are consistent with what David Paulides, working outside the academic framework from a different methodological tradition, had been documenting for years, and consistent with what the oral traditions of multiple indigenous nations describe when they talk about specific places that are known to take people. The question of why specific places produce specific patterns of disappearance across long periods of time, across different cultural groups, across different technological eras, is not a question that current science can answer. It may be a question that current science is not adequately equipped to ask. The epistemological frameworks within which most Western scientific inquiry operates do not have good categories for the phenomenon. They are built around the assumption that the landscape is a passive backdrop against which human activity occurs, not an active participant in the dynamic that produces specific outcomes. Indigenous knowledge systems, at least some of them, do not make that assumption. They treat the landscape as an active participant, as an entity that responds to how it is treated, and that has specific qualities in specific places that determine what outcomes are possible in those places. This does not mean that indigenous knowledge systems are correct in all their specific claims. It means that their fundamental framing may be capturing something that Western scientific frameworks systematically miss, and that the missing persons patterns may be, in part, evidence of what gets lost when the framework that does capture it is destroyed. This is the outermost edge of what this story reaches toward. It is not comfortable territory. It is not territory that comes with clean answers or validated explanations. It is territory where the honest position is uncertainty, where the most accurate thing you can say is that we do not fully know what is happening, that the patterns exceed our current explanatory frameworks, and that the knowledge systems that might have provided better frameworks were damaged in ways that cannot be quickly repaired. But uncertainty is not the same as ignorance. Uncertainty does not preclude action. The structural conditions that produce the crisis in missing Indigenous women and girls are not uncertain. They are thoroughly documented. The institutional failures that allow those conditions to persist are not uncertain. They are established. The knowledge gaps that make wilderness navigation more dangerous than it needs to be are not uncertain. They are real and measurable. The solutions, in their broad outlines, are not mysterious. They require sustained political will and substantial resources and genuine partnership with the communities that bear the costs of the current situation. The uncertainty exists at the edges, in the questions that pattern without explanation, in the places that take people in ways that available frameworks do not fully account for. Those questions deserve serious attention. They deserve the kind of serious, rigorous, open-minded inquiry that combines the best of Western scientific method with the accumulated expertise of Indigenous knowledge traditions. They deserve research programs that take seriously the possibility that there is something happening in specific landscapes that current science does not understand, and that Indigenous oral traditions have been pointing at for longer than the modern scientific enterprise has existed. That research is beginning to happen in small and scattered ways, through collaborations between Indigenous knowledge holders and Western researchers who are genuinely committed to treating Indigenous knowledge as the expert knowledge it is. It is not happening fast enough, or at a scale commensurate with what the patterns suggest is needed, but it is happening. And that matters, because at the deepest level, the story of Canada's missing is a story about knowledge, about who has it and who does not, about who is allowed to claim expertise and whose expertise is ignored, about what gets counted as real and what gets dismissed as superstition, about the consequences, measured in missing persons files and in families waiting for answers, of getting those questions wrong. The land of Canada holds its secrets in ways that are both practically explicable and, at the margins, genuinely mysterious. The people who were its most careful readers for thousands of years were stripped of their ability to read it and to transmit that reading to their children. The people who now move through it mostly do so without adequate preparation for what it is and what it requires. And the people who are responsible for providing that preparation, the institutions and the governments and the corporations that benefit from access to this territory, have not discharged that responsibility with anything approaching the seriousness that the situation demands. Until that changes, the landscape will continue to do what it has always done. It will receive what is brought to it. It will hold what it takes. And the numbers will continue to accumulate, one disappearance at a time, one family left without answers at a time, one piece of ancient knowledge lost from the world at a time. The highway goes on. The forest continues. The lakes hold their cold secrets. And somewhere in the enormous, ancient, beautiful, and unforgiving landscape of this country, people are missing who should not be. That is the story of Canada's missing. Not a mystery that cannot be explained. A mystery that has been explained, again and again, by people who know this land and its history and the cost of what was done to both. A mystery that persists, not because the answer is unknown, but because the answer is inconvenient, because it requires acknowledging things that are hard to acknowledge, and changing things that have powerful interests arrayed against their changing. The answer is in the land. It has always been in the land. The land has always known. We have simply not been willing to listen. There are languages in Canada that have not been spoken for generations. There are languages that have one living speaker, two living speakers, a handful of elderly people who carry within them the last living expressions of cognitive frameworks that evolved over thousands of years of intimate engagement with specific landscapes. When those people die, something dies with them that cannot be recovered, that cannot be reconstructed from recordings or academic transcriptions, because the language was not just a communication system, It was a way of thinking about the world, a set of categories and relationships and perceptions that are encoded in its grammar and its vocabulary, and that do not translate into English or French, because the concepts they express do not have English or French equivalents. The connection between language loss and the loss of the specific kinds of knowledge that language encoded is documented in the linguistics literature, but not widely understood outside it. Different languages do not simply use different words for the same things. They sometimes segment the world into different things. They sometimes notice different distinctions between phenomena that other languages treat as the same. They sometimes encode relationships between aspects of the world that other languages do not recognize as related. The Cree language, for example, has extraordinarily precise vocabulary for describing ice conditions, weather patterns, and animal behavior that exists because the people who developed that vocabulary needed to make distinctions that their survival depended on. In a landscape where the difference between two states of ice or two patterns of animal movement could mean the difference between a successful hunt and starvation, that vocabulary encodes knowledge. It encodes the accumulated observations of many generations of people who paid extremely close attention to their environment and who developed the linguistic tools necessary to store and communicate what they observed. When the children, who would have been the next generation of Cree speakers, were taken to residential schools and beaten for speaking Cree, that knowledge was interrupted, not destroyed entirely, because the language survived, in reduced and damaged form, carried by elders who had been forced underground with their knowledge and their language, but interrupted. The transmission was broken. The children who should have grown up hearing that precise vocabulary in context, who should have had it demonstrated for them in the field, in the seasons, in the actual conditions it was developed to describe, instead grew up speaking English and absorbing a worldview that treated the distinctions encoded in Cree as irrelevant or incomprehensible. The consequence of that interruption is not just cultural, it is practical. People who are trying to navigate the landscape that Cree vocabulary was developed to describe without that vocabulary are navigating with reduced precision. They are trying to make the same distinctions with blunter tools. And in the specific conditions where precision matters most, where the ice is in a state that requires a specific assessment and a specific response, the absence of the precise vocabulary for that assessment is not just an inconvenience, it is a risk. The language revitalization efforts happening across Canada right now are not simply cultural projects, though they are also that. They are practical efforts to recover functional knowledge that was deliberately destroyed. The linguists and the communities working to document and teach endangered Indigenous languages understand this. The policymakers who fund language revitalization at levels far below what the task requires often do not. Let us go back to the specific geography of disappearance one more time, to a region that embodies the paradox of Canada's missing in perhaps its most complete form, the interior of British Columbia. Specifically, the region between Prince George and the Alberta border, the territory that includes the headwaters of the Peace River and the upper reaches of the Fraser drainage, the place where the Rocky Mountain Trench runs north to south for hundreds of kilometers through country that is simultaneously stunning and genuinely dangerous. This is the territory of the Sekani and the Dunzar and the Dene peoples, nations that have inhabited the interior plateau and the mountain ranges at its eastern edge for thousands of years. It is country where the winters are long and severe, where the mountains create weather patterns that can change from clear to lethal within hours, where the rivers are powerful and cold and deceptive in their currents. It is country that requires specific knowledge to inhabit and to travel through safely, knowledge that the peoples of those nations developed over generations and that exists, where it still exists, in their oral traditions and their land management practices and their understanding of what the landscape requires of the people who move through it. It is also the region where, in recent decades, significant numbers of people have gone missing in the backcountry, where the search and rescue statistics are consistently among the most challenging in the province, and where the overlay of resource development, mining roads, remote work camps, and the transient populations they generate creates the specific combination of conditions that produces the pattern we have been describing. In 2015, a Second elder named George Desjardins gave a presentation to a gathering of search and rescue professionals in Prince George. He spoke for nearly 2 hours about the specific dangerous places in the territory, about the reasons they were dangerous that went beyond what any topographic map would show, about the protocols that his nation had developed most generations for navigating those places safely. He spoke about the relationship between the disappearances that occurred in the territory and the breakdown of the knowledge and the protocols that had historically prevented them. He was, by all accounts, both precise and generous in sharing information that he acknowledged was normally restricted in its transmission, but that he had decided to share because the cost of not sharing it was being paid in missing people. The search and rescue professionals who heard him describe it later as one of the most practically useful presentations they had ever attended, one that changed how they approached searches in the territory in specific and measurable ways. His knowledge was validated, in their experience, in subsequent searches that went differently because they had integrated what he told them. But his presentation was not recorded in any formal way. It was not incorporated into any official protocol. It was not passed on systematically to the next cohort of search and rescue professionals who would need to operate in that territory. George Desjardins died in 2019. The knowledge he shared in that presentation exists now only in the memories of the people who were in the room, in informal conversations, in the practical adjustments that the individuals who heard him made in their own practice. It is not institutionalized. It is not documented. It is not part of any formal curriculum or protocol that will be available to the search and rescue professionals operating in that territory in 5 years or 10 years, when none of the current responders are in their roles anymore. This is how knowledge dies, not in dramatic fires, in the quiet failure to take it seriously, to treat it as the resource it is, to put the institutional structures in place that would preserve it and transmit it and apply it. It dies in the gap between what is known and what is valued. It dies in the space between a presentation given to a room full of people and a formal protocol that incorporates what was presented. It dies one death at a time, one elder at a time, one generation at a time, in the ongoing aftershock of a deliberate historical campaign to destroy exactly this kind of knowledge. The missing people of Canada are, in part, the cost of each of those deaths. The cost of each piece of knowledge that died before it could be transmitted. The cost of each protocol that was never institutionalized. The cost of each relationship between a community and its landscape that was severed before it could be recorded. The cost, accumulated over more than a century of deliberate policy and ongoing structural neglect, of treating the knowledge that was here before as valueless. That cost is enormous. It is paid in lives, in families that wait years for answers, in communities that bear the weight of repeated loss without adequate support, in landscapes that hold their secrets in ways that modern search and rescue methods cannot always penetrate. And it is ongoing, not because it cannot be changed, but because changing it requires a depth of institutional commitment and political will that has not yet been fully assembled, and because the forces that benefit from the current arrangements are not strongly motivated to see them changed. The story of Canada's missing is, ultimately, a story about accountability, about who is accountable for the conditions that produce the patterns, about who bears the cost of the decisions that have been made and that continue to be made, about the relationship between historical actions and present consequences, and about the obligations that relationship creates. In the summer of 2019, a group of researchers from the University of Alberta conducted a survey of oral traditions from 12 different First Nations communities across the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. They were looking specifically for traditions that encoded information about landscape hazards, places that the oral traditions identified as dangerous, and for which the traditions provided specific guidance about how to navigate safely, what to do and what not to do in specific locations under specific conditions. What they found was extensive, detailed, and consistent in ways that exceeded their expectations. Every community they consulted had oral traditions that encoded specific geographical knowledge. Every community had traditions that identified specific places as dangerous in ways that went beyond simple physical description, that included behavioral protocols, seasonal considerations, and in many cases, specific relationships between the danger and the behavior of specific animal species, or the behavior of the weather, or the behavior of the water. And when they cross-reference the locations identified in oral traditions as dangerous with the search and rescue incident records for those territories, the correlation was statistically significant. The places that oral traditions identified as dangerous were places where, in the recorded search and rescue data, incidents occurred at elevated rates. The correlation was not perfect, but it was real. The knowledge embedded in the oral traditions was not myth. It was geography. It was risk information. It was exactly what you would want to have if you were trying to navigate those territories safely. The study was published in a geography journal and was reviewed positively by specialists in the field. It did not make headlines. It did not prompt any significant policy response. It joined the growing body of research that establishes the validity and the practical utility of indigenous ecological knowledge, research that accumulates quietly and that changes, slowly and unevenly, how some researchers and some practitioners approach their work, but that has not yet translated into the kind of institutional change that would be required to actually address the patterns it documents. This is the rhythm of the story. Evidence accumulates, research is conducted, reports are written, recommendations are made, and the gap between what is known and what is done with what is known persists. Not because the knowledge is unavailable, not because the solutions are unclear, but because the translation from knowledge to action requires political will, and political will requires pressure, and pressure requires that the people with the most power in the system feel the weight of what is being demanded of them in ways that they currently mostly do not. The communities that bear the weight of the missing persons crisis are not politically powerless. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls demonstrated that political pressure from those communities and their allies can produce a major national response, even if the implementation of that response remains incomplete. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission demonstrated the same thing. There is a precedent for this kind of national accounting, for this kind of acknowledgement of systemic failure and articulation of required change. But precedent is not enough. Each acknowledgement has to be followed by action, and each action has to be followed by accountability for whether the action was taken and whether it was effective. That accountability has been the weakest link in every cycle of reckoning and response that Canada has gone through in relation to the treatment of Indigenous peoples. The 74th Call to Action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls on the Government of Canada to provide sufficient resources to permit Indigenous communities to undertake their own research and produce their own histories of specific institutions, including residential schools. The 94th Call to Action calls for the adoption and implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. These are not small or simple asks. They require fundamental changes in how the relationship between the Canadian state and Indigenous peoples is structured, in who has authority over what, in how resources are allocated, and in who is listened to when decisions that affect Indigenous territories and Indigenous lives are being made. Those changes are in process. They are happening too slowly and with too many setbacks and with too much continuing damage being done in the interim. But they are happening. And they are being driven, as they have always been driven, by the persistent insistence of Indigenous peoples and their allies that the status quo is not acceptable and that the obligations incurred by the history of this country are real and must be discharged. The families of the missing are at the centre of this insistence. The families of Sisters in Spirit, the Highway of Tears Symposium, the Native Women's Association of Canada, the dozens of organisations across the country that have been working for decades to ensure that the missing are not forgotten and that the conditions that produce the missing are changed. These are the political force that has driven every significant advance in national attention to this issue. They have done this work with inadequate funding and inadequate support and inadequate recognition, and they have done it because the alternative, stopping, accepting that the disappearances will continue without adequate response, is not an alternative they are willing to accept. This is one of the things that Canada's missing persons crisis teaches, if you are willing to learn from it. It teaches that knowledge suppressed is not knowledge destroyed, that the people who had the knowledge and who had it taken from them, or whose children had it taken from them, or whose grandchildren had it taken from them, have not simply accepted that loss and moved on. They have been fighting to recover it, to transmit what survived, to rebuild what was broken, and to ensure that the systems that did the breaking are held accountable. That fight is not finished. It will not be finished quickly. But it is real, and it is ongoing, and it has produced and continues to produce real changes, however slow and however partial. In the boreal forest, north of a town called La Ronge, in northern Saskatchewan, there is an elder named Dorothy Beaulieu, who has spent 30 years working with young people from her Lac La Ronge Indian band community to teach them the skills and the knowledge that her grandparents taught her. She teaches them how to read the land, how to understand the weather, how to move through the boreal safely in all seasons, how to find food and water and shelter in conditions that would be lethal to someone without that knowledge. She teaches them the names of places and the stories those names encode. She teaches them the protocols for specific locations, the behavioral requirements of specific seasons, the relationship between specific observable phenomena and specific practical implications. She has been doing this because she watched a generation of young people from her community lose their lives or their well-being to the combined effects of colonial trauma and geographical ignorance, of being in a landscape whose knowledge they had been denied, and whose demands they were therefore inadequately prepared for. She decided that this was not acceptable, and that she was in a position to do something about it, and she has been doing something about it for 3 decades. Her work is not funded by any government program. It does not appear in any official reconciliation action plan. It is sustained by her own determination and by the gratitude of the families whose young people have come back from the land, knowing things they would not otherwise have known, equipped in ways they would not otherwise have been equipped. It is the kind of work that the country needs 10,000 more people doing, with the resources and the institutional support that would allow it to scale to the size the need requires. That work is possible. The knowledge that needs to be transmitted still exists, in the memories of elders, and in the fragments preserved in recording, and in the practice of the communities that have maintained cultural continuity despite everything that was done to interrupt it. The teachers exist, the students exist, the territories exist, waiting to be known again in the ways they once were known. What is needed is the political decision to make this work a priority, to fund it at the scale required, to integrate it into the institutions that govern how people move through and relate to these landscapes, and to hold those institutions accountable for whether the integration is real and effective. That decision has not yet been fully made. It is being moved toward, haltingly and unevenly, by the persistent pressure of the people who have the most to gain from it. But it has not yet been made with the finality and the resource commitment that the scale of the need requires. Until it is, the landscape will continue to hold its secrets. The rivers will keep their cold in. The forest will continue to receive what is brought to it. And the number, 100,000 reported missing per year, will continue to accumulate, one disappearance at a time, each one carrying within it the compressed weight of everything we have discussed tonight, the ancient knowledge and the colonial destruction, and the structural conditions, and the institutional failures, and the individual human being who walked into the Canadian landscape and did not come back. Each of those people was somebody's child, somebody's parent, somebody's partner, somebody's friend. Each of them had a story that was not finished when they disappeared. Each of their families has been living inside that unfinished story, waiting for a conclusion that may never come, or that may come in the worst possible form, or that may eventually come in a form that allows some measure of understanding and some measure of peace. They deserve better. They deserve better before they went missing, and they deserve better in the response to their disappearance. That is the most basic and the most urgent truth that the story of Canada's missing contains. Not a geopolitical argument, or a historical analysis, or a policy recommendation, though it contains all of those things. Just this: they deserved better. They deserve better now. And the country that they disappeared from has the knowledge and the resources to do better, if it chooses to exercise the will to do so. Let us return to the land one more time. Let us go to the specific quality of the Canadian landscape that makes it unlike almost any other landscape on Earth, and that shapes everything about how this story unfolds and why it continues. Canada contains, within its borders, approximately 20% of the world's fresh water. This includes the Great Lakes, which together hold roughly 21% of the world's surface fresh water. It includes Hudson Bay, which is technically a sea, but which is so deeply connected to the freshwater systems of northern Canada that it functions as the terminus of one of the most complex hydrological systems on the planet. It includes tens of thousands of rivers, hundreds of thousands of lakes, and wetland systems that in aggregate cover an area larger than many individual countries. Water, in the Canadian landscape, is not a feature. It is the organizing principle. The entire geography of the country is organized around water. The drainage patterns, the settlement patterns, the travel routes, the ecological systems, the weather, all of it is shaped by the water, by where it is and where it goes and what it does. The Indigenous peoples of Canada understood this with a depth and a precision that is only beginning to be appreciated by Western science. They understood not just where the water was, but how it moved, how it changed with season and with weather, how it behaved in specific locations under specific conditions. They understood which lakes were safe to cross and when, and which were not and why. They understood which river channels were navigable and which were not, and what the signals were that told you the conditions were changing. They understood the relationship between the water and the ice, the specific stages of freeze-up and break-up that were each recognizable by specific indicators, and that each required specific protocols. This knowledge, applied in practice across thousands of kilometers of waterway over thousands of years, is what made it possible to travel through the Canadian landscape efficiently and safely. The canoe routes of the Anishinaabe and the Cree and the other nations of the boreal forest were not improvised paths through hostile territory. They were carefully maintained highways, portions of which could be traveled at specific speeds under specific conditions, with knowledge of the water at every step of the way. The fur trade, which was the economic engine of the early colonial period in Canada, ran on those routes. The European traders who expanded the fur trade relied entirely on indigenous knowledge and indigenous guides and indigenous labor to navigate the waterways of the interior. Without that knowledge, the fur trade could not have functioned. The knowledge that made the fur trade possible was the knowledge that had been built up over thousands of years of indigenous occupation of the territory. It was not a gift that the indigenous peoples gave freely and without consequence. It was knowledge that was extracted from them, often under conditions of profound power imbalance, and that benefited the extractors in ways that it was not designed to benefit. The fur trade enriched European trading companies and the colonial governments that backed them. It enriched individual European traders. It did not, in the long run, enhance the position of the indigenous peoples whose knowledge and whose landscapes made the whole enterprise possible. In many cases, it actively damaged them by creating dependencies on trade goods, by introducing disease, by restructuring social relationships in ways that eroded the cultural frameworks within which the knowledge was transmitted. This is the pattern of extraction that has characterized the relationship between Canadian state interests and Indigenous knowledge from the beginning. Take the knowledge. Use the knowledge. Do not acknowledge the knowledge as knowledge, or the people who hold it as the experts they are. And when the immediate extractive purpose has been served, move on, leaving the landscape depleted and the communities diminished, without having invested in the conditions that would allow the knowledge to be maintained and transmitted to future generations. It is still happening. The resource development projects that move into Indigenous territories in the 21st century are not relying on Indigenous knowledge in the same direct way that the fur traders relied on indigenous canoe routes. But they are affecting the landscapes in which that knowledge was developed and maintained, and they are doing so without adequately accounting for the knowledge that those landscapes contain, or the consequences of disrupting the conditions that have allowed that knowledge to survive. The pipelines and the mines and the logging roads that extend into the territories of northern indigenous communities are not neutral infrastructure. They change the land. They change the water. They change the animal populations. They change the conditions that the specific, practical knowledge of those territories was developed to describe. And when the conditions change, the knowledge that was developed in relationship with the prior conditions becomes partially or wholly inapplicable, without any process for developing new knowledge to replace it. The communities that hold the old knowledge watch it become obsolete faster than it can be replaced, in landscapes that are changing faster than any previous generation of knowledge holders had to account for. They watch the landscapes they know transform into landscapes they only partially recognize, and they watch the consequences of that transformation play out in the patterns of disappearance and difficulty and loss that are the subject of this story. This is the dimension of the crisis that connects it to the global climate emergency in ways that are not often made explicit. The Arctic and subarctic regions of Canada are among the most rapidly changing environments on the planet as the global climate shifts. The permafrost is thawing, the sea ice is retreating, the seasonal patterns are shifting, the animal populations are moving, the rivers are flooding at different times and in different ways. The landscapes that were known are becoming unknown, faster than knowledge can keep up. For the communities that have lived in those landscapes for thousands of years and that have survived previous climate fluctuations through exactly the kind of detailed empirical knowledge that we have been discussing, the current rate of change is unprecedented. There has always been change, and there has always been knowledge adaptation in response to change, but the current rate of change exceeds the rate at which oral tradition can adapt. The elders who know the old patterns are dying faster than the young people who need the new knowledge, can observe and experience the new conditions and develop the frameworks for understanding them. This is a knowledge crisis that is happening in real time, in specific communities, with specific human consequences. And it is happening in the context of all the other crises we have been discussing, the ongoing effects of colonial trauma, the inadequate funding and infrastructure, the institutional failures, the pattern of disappearance that continues without adequate response. It is one more layer of damage being added to a situation that is already profoundly damaged. The response to this emergency, if there is an adequate response, has to include the specific, targeted, urgently resourced effort to capture and transmit traditional ecological knowledge while the people who hold it are still alive. This is not a cultural luxury. It is a survival necessity, not just for the communities involved, but for the broader society that is going to have to navigate the climate-changed future alongside them, and that has been stripping itself of the most sophisticated set of empirical tools ever developed for long-term inhabitation of this specific landscape. The irony of Canada's situation, the profound historical irony that sits at the centre of the missing persons crisis and the broader crisis of Indigenous rights and recognition, is that the country that contains perhaps the richest surviving tradition of long-term ecological knowledge anywhere in the world has spent most of its existence actively destroying that knowledge, and is now facing exactly the kind of existential environmental challenges for which that knowledge would have been most useful. The knowledge was here. It is still here, damaged and reduced, but not gone. The people who hold it are still here, fighting against enormous odds to preserve and transmit what survived. The opportunity to treat it seriously, to resource it adequately, to integrate it into the decision-making systems that govern how this country relates to the landscape it is built upon, still exists. The missing are the measure of what happens when that opportunity is not taken. They are not just the victims of specific failures in specific investigations or specific inadequacies of search and rescue methodology. They are the ongoing consequence of a centuries-long decision to treat the knowledge of this land as irrelevant, as inferior, as something to be suppressed rather than honoured and preserved and used. Reversing that decision is the deepest answer to the question of why Canada's missing numbers are what they are. Not the only answer, not a quick answer, but the answer that goes to the root, that addresses the source rather than the symptoms, that treats the crisis not as an anomaly to be solved, but as the predictable outcome of identifiable historical choices that can be identified, acknowledged, and addressed. The land is waiting for that. The families of the missing are waiting for that. The communities that carry the knowledge are waiting for that. The question is whether the country is ready to finally hear what all of them have been saying for longer than most nations on Earth have existed. There is something else the land holds that we have not yet discussed. Something older than the most ancient oral tradition, older than the oldest human memory of this territory, older than any artifact that any search could recover from any burial site or midden or rock shelter. It is the record of what happened here before human beings arrived, and it is written in the landscape itself in ways that are slowly being read by the people who know how to read it. The Canadian landscape is a geology lesson that has not yet been fully taught. The Shield, the great Precambrian bedrock that forms the core of the country, is among the oldest exposed rock on the surface of the Earth. Parts of it date back more than 4 billion years to within the first 500 million years of the planet's existence. The rock of the Canadian Shield was already ancient when the first complex multicellular life was evolving in the world's oceans. It has been at the surface, or close to it, through ice ages and warm periods and extinctions and radiations and the entire 3 billion year history of life on land. This rock holds information. The mineral deposits it contains, the traces of ancient geological processes written in its chemistry, the glacial features carved into its surface by the great ice sheets that have advanced and retreated across it multiple times, all of these encode data about what this part of the planet has been through on timescales that dwarf the entire period of human habitation. The indigenous peoples of the Shield understood this in their own terms. The Anishinaabe concept of Turtle Island, the idea that North America sits on the back of a great turtle, is sometimes dismissed as mythology, but there is a physical reality to which it corresponds. The Canadian Shield is geologically unusual in that it has been relatively tectonically stable for an extremely long time. A craton, a piece of the Earth's crust that has not been involved in major mountain building or subduction processes for billions of years. It is, in a very real geological sense, the stable center of the continent. The turtle is not mythology. It is an accurate metaphor for a geological fact that took Western science considerably longer to discover and describe. The deep time of this landscape shapes the human story of the missing in ways that are not obvious but that are real. The landscape was not made for human purposes. It was made by geological processes on geological timescales for geological reasons that have nothing to do with human survival or human well-being. The boreal forest and the Shield and the great rivers and the lakes exist because of the specific history of this piece of the planet's crust over billions of years. They are what they are because of the Grenville orogeny and the Trans-Hudson orogen and the Pennachian mountain building event and the Hudsonian tectonic episode and the Pleistocene glaciations and 10,000 other geological events that shape the rock and the soil and the drainage, patterns and the ecology over timeframes that make human history look like an afterthought. Human beings arrived in this landscape carrying their evolutionary heritage of savanna and woodland and moderate climate environments from Africa and had to figure out how to live in something that was not designed for them. The knowledge systems that the indigenous peoples developed over 15,000 or more years of inhabitation are the record of that figuring out. They are the accumulated practical result of trial and error and observation and innovation over hundreds of generations, the distilled wisdom of everything that worked and everything that did not work. In this specific landscape, with its specific challenges and its specific gifts, that knowledge was built on a foundation of deep familiarity with the geological and ecological realities of the landscape. It was not mystical, though it was also that. It was empirical. It was the product of sustained observation and systematic transmission and ongoing refinement, and it was specifically adapted to the landscape it described. Western knowledge systems were not developed in this landscape. They were imported from a different part of the world, carrying the assumptions and the categories and the ways of seeing that had been developed in the conditions of northwestern Europe, and they were applied to a landscape that those categories were not designed to describe. The mismatch has been producing consequences for 500 years. The missing persons crisis is one of those consequences, not the only one, not the most dramatic, but one of the most persistent and one of the most directly measurable. What would it look like if the mismatch were resolved? If the knowledge that was developed in this specific landscape were actually integrated into how the country makes decisions about the landscape, it would look like indigenous knowledge holders being treated as the geographical experts they are, rather than as stakeholders to be consulted on a checklist of requirements. It would look like traditional ecological knowledge being incorporated into environmental assessment processes at a depth that actually influences decisions, not as a box to be ticked, but as a substantive source of information that can change the conclusions of assessments and the conditions attached to approvals. It would look like the specific, dangerous places identified in oral traditions being incorporated into the maps and the protocols and the risk assessments that govern how search and rescue operations work and how recreational access is managed and how infrastructure is routed. It would look like language revitalization being funded at the scale required to actually save the languages that are dying, not at the scale that allows a government to say it is doing something about language revitalization. It would look like land management practices informed by traditional ecological management principles being applied at the scale required to actually address the ecological consequences of 500 years of management by people who did not know the landscape. It would look like the Highway of Tears having a bus service, not as a metaphor, as an actual physical bus service running along the route where women have been going missing for 50 years because they had no other way to travel. The federal government promised in 2015 to fund a bus service on Highway 16. As of 2022, that promise had not been fully implemented. A bus service, the simplest, most concrete, most immediately actionable intervention available, still not done 7 years after it was promised. This is the gap between what is known and what is done, between what is promised and what is implemented, between the acknowledgement of a crisis and the response commensurate with its scale. It is measured in continued disappearances, and in communities still waiting and in families still without answers. The bus service is not the whole solution. It is one small piece of the structural change required, but it is a piece so basic and so achievable and so clearly necessary that its absence, years after it was promised, is a kind of indicator of where the political will actually sits when the crisis recedes from immediate media attention and the pressure for action decreases. This is the rhythm of the story. The crisis peaks in attention. There are inquiries, reports, recommendations, promises. Then attention recedes. The inertia of systems built to do things differently reasserts itself. The promises are partially implemented, slowly, with reduced ambition, and then set aside as the political context changes and other priorities emerge. And the crisis continues, in the lives of people who cannot afford to wait for the next cycle of attention. The missing do not stop being missing when the political attention moves elsewhere. The families do not stop waiting. The communities do not stop bearing the weight of inadequate response and continued loss. They continue, in the space between the crises of attention, doing the work of survival and advocacy and remembrance and insistence with whatever resources they can assemble, waiting for the country to make the decision to actually address the conditions that produce the outcomes they are living inside. That decision is within reach. It has been within reach for decades. The knowledge of what needs to be done exists. The resources to do it exist. The obligation to do it is legally and ethically established through treaty, through constitutional obligation, through the explicit commitments made in the course of multiple national inquiries and commissions and reconciliation processes. The night is very quiet now. The The kind of quiet that exists in places far from roads, far from cities, far from the ambient hum of infrastructure and human activity. The kind of quiet that has existed in the Canadian landscape for longer than any human voice has been raised within it. The kind of quiet that the land returns to between the periods of human presence, that it maintains with equal serenity in the spaces that humans have never entered, and in the spaces that humans once entered and then left. In the boreal forest, the night is not empty. It is full of sound, but it is not the kind of sound that most modern ears are trained to hear and interpret. Owls. The distant creak and groan of trees under wind, the sound of water moving through the dark, the sound of ice settling or thawing, depending on the season, the sounds of animals moving through the undergrowth with the specific cadences that tell a practiced ear exactly what kind of animal and exactly what it is doing. A practiced ear, an ear trained by years of listening, by a knowledge tradition that taught it what to hear and how to hear it. An ear connected to a mind that knows what the sounds mean. There are people in Canada who have that ear. Not many. Not as many as there should be. Not as many as there were. But some. And in the communities where that knowledge has been most successfully preserved and transmitted, the landscape is not a mystery. It is a text. A deeply familiar, deeply known text, readable in the dark, readable in all weathers, readable through all seasons, because the knowledge of how to read it was transmitted through exactly the conditions in which it needs to be applied. The rest of the country moves through a different version of the same landscape, one that looks like wilderness because it is not understood, one that feels like emptiness because the knowledge that would fill it with meaning is not available to the people moving through it. They navigate by GPS and by topographic maps, and by the advice of travel guides, and by the information in outdoor recreation apps, none of which comes close to the depth of the knowledge that would allow a person to move through this landscape with the confidence and the safety that the landscape's most experienced inhabitants once possessed. This is the context in which the disappearances happen. Not in a landscape without knowledge. In a landscape whose knowledge has been suppressed and replaced with something that is not adequate to the task. In a landscape that was known and is now, to too many of the people moving through it, unknown. The missing are in that landscape. Some of them are alive and waiting for rescue. Some of them have been dead for years, and their remains are somewhere in the vast, cold interior of the country, waiting to be found or never to be found, depending on what the landscape decides. Some of them are in the in-between, the space of not knowing, where their families live, where the statistics live, where the story lives that is not yet resolved. What we know is that the landscape is real, and the history that shaped the conditions in which people disappear within it is real, and the knowledge that was destroyed is real, and the structural failures that allow the conditions to persist are real, and the obligation to do better is real. What we know is that the people who are missing were real, are real, in the sense that their absence is a real thing in the world, a real gap in the lives of the people who loved them. What we know is that the answer to why this happens, the answer to why Canada's missing numbers are what they are, is not a mystery in the sense of something unknowable. It is a story. A long, old, layered, difficult story that starts in the geology of the continent and runs through the deepest human prehistory and the colonial catastrophe and the structural conditions of the present and arrives, inevitably, at the reality of the missing, at the families, at the landscape, at the knowledge that was here and that is diminished and that is still, stubbornly, persistently, in the face of everything that was done to destroy it, present enough to offer the possibility of a different future, if the choice is made to pursue it. That is where we are. The story has not ended. The landscape is waiting. The families are waiting. The knowledge is waiting, in the memories of elders and in the practices of communities, and in the archives of researchers who have spent careers trying to ensure that it is not lost, waiting for the day when the country decides to treat it with the seriousness it deserves. The night continues. The boreal forest continues. The rivers move in the dark toward the sea, and somewhere in the enormous, ancient, storied landscape of this country, the missing wait, and the people who loved them wait in their own kind of dark and the land holds everything in the silence that it has maintained for longer than memory. We are small in this landscape. We have always been small in this landscape. The people who learnt to live here well understood that smallness and developed their knowledge and their protocols and their relationships with the land in full acknowledgement of it. That humility and the knowledge it produced are the things that were taken. They are the things that need to be returned. They are the things that the missing, in their absence, are asking for. The missing are remembered. The knowledge is preserved. What remains of it? The land is still here, patient as geology, full as time, and the story continues, unfinished, in the dark, in the quiet, in the wait that has no certain end. Sleep well, the land is old, the night is deep, and the story, which belongs to all of us, is still being written. The people who know this land are still here. Their knowledge, diminished but not gone, is still here. The obligation to listen is still here, waiting to be met.